Chapter 25 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Lou in New York City. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 25. He followed his guide up the steep flights, which seemed to become buoyant and lift him like waves. It was as if the muscle that always dragged back his lame leg had suddenly regained its elasticity. He floated up as one mounts stairs in a dream. A smell of disinfectants hung in the cold air, and once, through a half-open door, a sickening odor came. He remembered it from Chalon, and Fortin's murmured, "Gangrene. Oh, if only we could get them sooner." How soon had they got his boy? Campton wondered. The letter, mercifully sent by hand to Paris, had reached him on the third day after George's arrival at the Doullens hospital. But he did not yet know how long before that the shell splinter had done its work. The nurse did not know either. How could she remember? They had so many. The administrator would look up the files and tell him. Only there was no time for that now. On a landing, Campton heard a babble and scream, a nauseating scream in a queer, bleached voice that might have been man, woman, or monkeys. Perhaps that was what the French meant by a white voice, this voice which was as featureless as some of the poor men's obliterated faces. Campton shot an anguished look at his companion, and she understood and shook her head. "Oh, no, that's in the big ward. It's the way they scream after a dressing." She opened a door, and he was in a room with 3 beds in it, wooden pallets hastily knocked together and spread with rough gray blankets. In spite of the cold, flies still swarmed on the unwashed panes, and there were big holes in the fly net over the bed nearest the window. Under the net lay a middle-aged, bearded man, heavily bandaged about the chest and left arm. He was snoring, his mouth open, his gaunt cheeks drawn in with the fight for breath. Campton said to himself that if his own boy lived, he should like some day to do something for this poor devil who was his roommate. Then he looked about him and saw that the 2 other beds were empty, and he drew back. The nurse was bending over the bearded man. "He'll wake presently. I'll leave you." And she slipped out. Campton looked again at the stranger. Then his glance traveled to the scarred brown hand on the sheet, a hand with broken nails and blackened fingertips. It was George's hand, his son's, swollen, disfigured, but unmistakable. The father knelt down and laid his lips on it. "What was the first thing you felt?" Adele Anthony asked him afterwards, and he answered, "Nothing." "Yes, at the very first, I know, it's always like that. But the first thing after you began to feel anything." He considered and then said slowly, "The difference." "The difference in him?" "In him, in life, in everything." Miss Anthony, who understood as a rule, was evidently puzzled. "What kind of a difference?" "Oh, a complete difference." With that she had to be content. The sense of it had first come to Campton when the bearded man, raising his lids, looked at him from far off with George's eyes and touched him very feebly with George's hand. It was in the moment of identifying his son that he felt the son he had known to be lost to him forever. George's lips were moving, and the father laid his ear to them. Perhaps these were the last words that his boy was saying. "Old Dad? In a motor?" Campton nodded. The fact seemed faintly to interest George, who continued to examine him with those distant eyes. "Uncle Andy's?" Campton nodded again. "Mother?" "She's coming too, very soon." George's lips were screwed into a whimsical smile. "I must have a shave first," he said, and drowsed off again, his hand in Campton's. "The other gentleman?" the nurse questioned the next morning. Campton had spent the night in the hospital, stretched on the floor at his son's threshold. It was a breach of rules, but for once the major had condoned it. As for Mr. Brandt, Campton had forgotten all about him, and at first did not know what the nurse meant. Then he woke with a start to the consciousness of his fellow traveler's nearness. Mr. Brant, the nurse explained, had come to the hospital early and had been waiting below for the last 2 hours. Campton, almost as gaunt and unshorn as his son, pulled himself to his feet and went down. In the hall, the banker, very white but smooth and trim as ever, was patiently measuring the muddy flags. "Less temperature this morning," Campton called from the last flight. "Oh," stammered Mr. Brant, red and pale by turns. Campton smiled haggardly and pulled himself together in an effort of communicativeness. "Look here, he's asked for you. You'd better go up, only for a few minutes, please. He's awfully weak." Mr. Brant, speechless, stood stiffly waiting to be conducted. Campton noticed the mist in his eyes and took pity on him. "I say, where's the hotel? Just a step away? I'll go around then and get a shave and a wash while you're with him," the father said with a magnanimity which he somehow felt the powers might take account of in their subsequent dealings with George. If the boy was to live, Campton could afford to be generous, and he had decided to assume that the boy would live, and to order his behavior accordingly. "I thank you," said Mr. Brant, turning toward the stairs. 5 minutes at the outside, Campton cautioned him, and hurried out into the morning air, through which the guns still crashed methodically. When he got back to the hospital, refreshed and decent, he was surprised and for a moment alarmed to find that Mr. Brant had not come down. Sending up his temperature, of course, damn him, Campton raged, scrambling up the stairs as fast as his stiff leg permitted. But outside of George's door he saw a small figure patiently mounting guard. "I stayed with him less than 5 minutes. I was merely waiting to thank you." "Oh, that's all right." Campton paused and then made his supreme effort. "How does he strike you?" Hopefully. He had his joke, as usual," Mr. Brant said with a twitching smile. "Oh, that. But his temperature's decidedly lower. Of course, they may have to take the ball out of the lung, but perhaps before they do it he can be moved from this hell." The two men were silent, the same passion of anxiety consuming them, and no means left of communicating it to each other. "I'll look in again later. Shall I have something to eat sent round to you from the hotel?" Mr. Brant suggested. "Oh, thanks, if you would." Campton put out his hand and crushed Mr. Brant's dry fingers. But for this man he might not have got to his son in time, and this man had not once made use of the fact to press his own claim on George. With pity in his heart, the father, privileged to remain at his son's bedside, watched Mr. Brant's small figure retreating alone. How ghastly to sit all day in that squalid hotel, his eyes on his watch, with nothing to do but to wonder and wonder about the temperature of another man's son. The next day was worse, so much worse that everything disappeared from Campton's view but the present agony of watching, hovering, hanging helplessly on the words of nurse and doctor, and spying on the glances they exchanged behind his back. There could be no thought yet of extracting the bullet. A great surgeon, passing through the wards on a hasty tour of inspection, had confirmed this verdict. Oh, to have kept the surgeon there, to have had him at hand, to watch for the propitious moment, and seize it without an instant's delay. Suddenly the vision, which to Campton had been among the most hideous of all his crowding nightmares, that of George stretched naked on an operating table, his face hidden by a chloroform mask, and an orderly hurrying away with a pile of red towels like those perpetually carried through the passages below. This vision became to the father's fevered mind as soothing as a glimpse of paradise. If only George's temperature would go down, if only the doctors would pronounce him strong enough to have the bullet taken out. What would anything else matter then? Campton would feel as safe as he used to years ago, when after the recurring months of separation the boy came back from school and he could take him in his arms and make sure that he was the same Geordie, only bigger, browner, with thicker, curlier hair and tougher muscles behind his jacket. What if the great surgeon, on his way back from the front, were to pass through the town again that evening, reverse his verdict, and perhaps even perform the operation then and there? Was there no way of prevailing on him to stop and take another look at George on the return? The idea took immediate possession of Campton, crowding out his intolerable anguish and bringing such relief that for a few seconds he felt as if some life-saving operation had been performed on himself. As he stood watching the great man's retreat, followed by doctors and nurses, Mr. Brant suddenly touched his arm, and the eyes of the two met. Campton understood and gasped out, "Yes, yes, we must manage to get him back." Mr. Brant nodded, at all costs. He paused again, interrogated Campton's eyes, and stammered, "You authorize?" "Oh, God, anything." "He's dined at my house in Paris," Mr. Brant threw in, as if trying to justify himself. "Oh, go, go!" Campton almost pushed him down the stairs. 10 minutes later he reappeared, modest but exultant. "Well?" "He wouldn't commit himself before the others." "Oh." But to me, as he was getting into the motor, "Well, yes, if possible, somewhere about midnight." Campton turned away, choking, and stumped off toward the tall window at the end of the passage. Below him lay the court. A line of stretchers was being carried across it, not empty this time, but each one with a bloody burden. Doctors, nurses, orderlies hurried to and fro. Drub, drub, drub went the guns, shaking the windows, rolling their fierce din along the cloudy sky, down the corridors of the hospital and the pavement of the streets, like huge bowls crashing through story above story of a kind of skyscraping bowling alley. "Even the dead underground must hear them," Campton muttered. The word made him shudder superstitiously, and he crept back to George's door and opened it. But the nurse within shook her head. He must sleep after the examination. Better go. Campton turned and saw Mr. Brant waiting. A bell rang 12. The two, in silence, walked down the stairs, crossed the court, averting their eyes from the stretchers, and went to the hotel to get something to eat. Midnight came. It passed. No one in the hurried, confused world of the hospital had heard of the possibility of the surgeon's returning. When Campton mentioned it to the nurse, she smiled her tired smile and said, "He could have done nothing." Done nothing? How could she know? How could anyone but the surgeon himself? Would he have promised if he had not thought there was some chance? Campton, stretched out on a blanket and his rolled-up coat, lay through the long, restless hours, staring at the moonlit sky framed by the window of the corridor. Great clouds swept over that cold, indifferent vault. They seemed like the smoke from the guns which had not once ceased through the night. At last he got up, turned his back on the window, and lay down again, facing the stairs. The moonlight unrolled a white strip along the stone floor. A church bell rang, 1, 2. There were noises and movements below. Campton raised himself, his heart beating all over his body. Steps came echoing up. "Careful," someone called. A stretcher rounded the stair rail, another and then another. An orderly with a lantern preceded them, followed by one of the doctors, an old bunched-up man in a muddy uniform who stopped furtively to take a pinch of snuff. Campton could not believe his eyes. Didn't the hospital people know that every bed on that floor was full? Every bed, that is, but the two in George's room, and the nurse had given Campton the hope, the promise almost, that as long as his boy was so ill, she would keep those empty. "I'll manage somehow," she had said. For a mad moment, Campton was on the point of throwing himself in the way of the tragic procession, barring the threshold with his arms. "What does this mean?" he stammered to the nurse, who had appeared from another room with her little lamp. She gave a shrug. "More casualties. Every hospital is like this." He stood aside, wrathful, impotent. At least if Brant had been there, perhaps by some offer of money. But how? To whom? Of what earthly use, after all, was Brant's boasted influence? These people would only laugh at him, perhaps put them both out of the hospital. He turned despairingly to the nurse. "You might as well have left him in the trenches." "Don't say that, sir," she answered, and the echo of his own words horrified him like a sacrilege. Two of the stretchers were carried into George's room. Campton caught a glimpse of George muttering and tossing. The moonlight lay in the hollows of his bearded face, and again the father had the sense of utter alienation from that dark, delirious man who, for brief intervals, suddenly became his son and then as suddenly wandered off into strangeness. The nurse slipped out of the room and signed to him. "Both nearly gone. They won't trouble him long," she whispered. The man on the third stretcher was taken to a room at the other end of the corridor. Campton watched him being lifted in. He was to lie on the floor, then? For in that room there was certainly no vacancy. But presently he had the answer. The bearers did not come out empty-handed. They carried another man, whom they laid on the empty stretcher. Lucky, lucky devil, going, no doubt, to a hospital at the rear. As the procession reached the stairs, the lantern swung above the lucky devil's face. His eyes stared ceilingward from black orbits. One arm, swinging loose, dangled down, the hand stealthily counting the steps as he descended. And no one troubled, for he was dead. At dawn, Campton, who must have been asleep, started up, again hearing steps. The surgeon! Oh, if this time it were the surgeon! But only Mr. Brant detached himself from the shadows accumulated in the long corridor. Mr. Brant, crumpled and unshorn, with bloodshot eyes and gloves on his unconscious hands. Campton glared at him resentfully. "Well, how about your surgeon? I don't see him," he exclaimed. Mr. Brant shook his head despondently. "No, I've been waiting all night in the court. I thought if he came back I should be the first to catch him. But he has just sent his orderly for instruments. He's not coming. There's been terrible fighting." Campton saw 2 tears running down Mr. Brant's face. They did not move him. The banker glanced toward George's door, full of the question he dared not put. Campton answered it. "You want to know how he is? Well, how should he be, with that bullet in him, and the fever eating him inch by inch, and 2 more wounded men in his room? That's how he is," Campton almost shouted. Mr. Brant was trembling all over. 2 more men? In his room? He echoed shrilly. "Yes, bad cases, dying." Campton drew a deep breath. "You see, there are times when your money and your influence and your knowing everybody are no more use than so much sawdust." The nurse opened the door and looked out. "You're talking too loudly," she said. She shut the door, and the 2 men stood silent, abashed. Finally, Mr. Brant turned away. "I'll go and try again. There must be other surgeons, other ways," he whispered. "Oh, your surgeons! Oh, your ways!" Campton sneered after him in the same whisper. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire Wilde. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 26. From the room where he sat at the foot of George's glossy white bed, Campton, through the open door, could watch the November sun slanting down a white ward where, in the lane between other white beds, pots of chrysanthemums stood on white covered tables. Through the window his eyes rested incredulously on a court enclosed in monastic arches of grey stone, with squares of turf bordered by box hedges, and a fountain playing. Beyond the court sloped the faded foliage of a park not yet entirely stripped by Channel gales, and, on days without wind, instead of the boom of the guns, the roar of the sea came faintly over intervening heights and hollows. Campton's ears were even more incredulous than his eyes. He was gradually coming to believe in George's white room, the ward beyond, the flowers between the beds, the fountain in the court. But the sound of the sea still came to him, intolerably but unescapably, as the crash of guns. When the impression was too overwhelming, he would turn away from the window and cast his glance on the bed, but only to find that the smooth young face on the pillow had suddenly changed into that of the haggard, bearded stranger on the wooden pallet at Doullens. And Campton would have to get up, lean over, and catch the twinkle in George's eyes before the evil spell was broken. Few words passed between them. George, after all these days, was still too weak for much talk, and silence had always been Campton's escape from feeling. He never had the need to speak in times of inward stress, unless it were to vent his anger, as in that hateful scene at Doullens between himself and Mr. Brant. But he was sure that George always knew what was passing through his mind, that when the sea boomed, their thoughts flew back together to that other scene, but a few miles and a few days distant, yet already as far off, as much an affair they were both rid of, as a nightmare to a wakened sleeper, and that for a moment the same vision clutched them both, mocking their attempts at indifference. Not that the sound, to Campton at any rate, suggested any abstract conception of war. Looking back afterward at this phase of his life, he perceived that at no time had he thought so little of the war. The noise of the sea was to him simply the voice of the engine which had so nearly destroyed his son. That association, deeply embedded in his half-dazed consciousness, left no room for others. The general impression of unreality was enhanced by his not having yet been able to learn the details of George's wounding. After a week, during which the boy had hung near death, the great surgeon, returning to Doullens just as Campton had finally ceased to hope for him, had announced that though George's state was still grave, he might be moved to a hospital at the rear. So, one day, miraculously, the perilous transfer had been made in one of Mrs. Brant's own motor ambulances, and for a week now George had lain in his white bed, hung over by white-gowned sisters, in an atmosphere of sweetness and order which almost made it seem as if he were a child recovering from illness in his own nursery, or a red-haired baby sparring with dimpled fists at a new world. In truth, Campton found his son as hard to get at as a baby. He looked at his father with eyes as void of experience, or at least of any means of conveying it. Campton, at first, could only marvel and wait, and the isolation in which the two were enclosed by George's weakness and by his father's inability to learn from others what the boy was not yet able to tell him, gave a strange remoteness to everything but the things which count in an infant's world: food, warmth, sleep. Campton's nearest approach to reality was his daily scrutiny of the temperature chart. He studied it as he used to study the communiqué, which he now no longer even thought of. Sometimes, when George was asleep, Campton would sit pondering on the days at Doullens. There was an exquisite joy in silently building up, on that foundation of darkness and anguish, the walls of peace that now surrounded him, a structure so transparent that one could peer through it at the rooted furies, yet so impenetrable that he sat there in a kind of godlike aloofness. For one thing, he was especially thankful, and that was the conclusion of his unseemly wrangle with Mr. Brant. Thankful that almost at once he had hurried after the banker, caught up with him, and stammered out, clutching his hand, I know how you feel." Mr. Brandt's reactions were never rapid, and the events of the preceding days had called upon faculties that were almost atrophied. He had merely looked at Campton in mute distress, returned his pressure, and silently remounted the hospital stairs with him. Campton hated himself for his ill temper, but was glad, even at the time, that no interested motive had prompted his apology. He should have hated himself even more if he had asked the banker's pardon because of Mr. Brandt's pull and the uses to which it might be put, or even if he had associated his excuses with any past motives of gratitude, such as the fact that but for Mr. Brandt he might never have reached George's side. Instead of that, he simply felt that once more his senseless violence had got the better of him, and he was sorry that he had behaved like a brute to a man who loved George and was suffering almost as much as he was at the thought that George might die. After that episode and Campton's apology, the relations of the two men became so easy that each gradually came to take the other for granted, and Mr. Brandt, relieved of a perpetual hostile scrutiny, was free to exercise his ingenuity in planning and managing. It was owing to him, Campton no longer minded admitting it, that the famous surgeon had hastened his return to Toulon, that George's translation to the sweet monastic building near the sea had been so rapidly effected, and that the great man, appearing there soon afterward, had extracted the bullet with his own hand. But for Mr. Brandt's persistence, even the leave to bring one of Mrs. Brandt's motor ambulances to Toulon would never have been given, and it might have been fatal to George to make the journey in a slow and jolting military train. But for Mr. Brandt, again, he would have been sent to a crowded military hospital instead of being brought to this white haven of rest. And all that just because I overtook him in time to prevent his jumping into his motor and going back to Paris in order to get out of my way. Campton, at the thought, lowered his spirit into new depths of contrition. George, who had been asleep, opened his eyes and looked at his father. "Where's Uncle Andy?" "Gone to Paris to get your mother." "Yes, of course, he told me." George smiled and withdrew once more into his secret world. But Campton's state of mind was less happy. As the time of Julia's arrival approached, he began to ask himself, with increasing apprehension, how she would fit into the situation. Mr. Brandt had fitted into it perfectly. Campton had actually begun to feel a secret dependence on him, a fidgety uneasiness since he had left for Paris, sweet though it was to be alone with George. But Julia, what might she not do and say to unsettle things, break the spell, agitate and unnerve them all? Campton did not question her love for her son, but he was not sure what form it would take in conditions to which she was so unsuited. How could she ever penetrate into the mystery of peace which enclosed him and his boy? And if she felt them thus mysteriously shut off, would she not dimly resent her exclusion? If only Adele Anthony had been coming too. Campton had urged Mr. Brandt to bring her, but the banker had failed to obtain a permit for anyone but the boy's mother. He had even found it difficult to get his own leave renewed. It was only after a first trip to Paris, and repeated efforts at the War Office, that he had been allowed to go to Paris and fetch his wife, who was just arriving from Biarritz. Well, for the moment, at any rate, Campton had the boy to himself. As he sat there, trying to picture the gradual resurrection of George's pre-war face out of the delicately penciled white mask on the pillow. He noted the curious change of planes produced by suffering and emaciation, and the altered relation of lights and shadows. Materially speaking, the new George looked like the old one seen in the bowl of a spoon, and through blue spectacles, peaked, narrow, livid, with elongated nose and sunken eye sockets. But these altered proportions were not what had really changed him. There was something in the curve of the mouth that fever and emaciation could not account for. In that new line, and in the look of his eyes, the look travelling slowly outward through a long blue tunnel, like some mysterious creature rising from the depths of the sea, that was where the new George lurked, the George to be watched and lain in wait for, patiently and slowly puzzled out. He reopened his eyes. Adele, too? Campton had learned to bridge over the spaces between the questions. No, not this time. We tried, but it couldn't be managed. A little later, I hope. She's all right? Rather. Blooming. And Boylston? Blooming too. George's lids closed contentedly, like doors shutting him away from the world. It was the first time since his operation that he had asked about any of his friends, or had appeared to think they might come to see him. But his mind, like his stomach, could receive very little nutriment at a time. He liked to have one mouthful given to him, and then to lie, ruminating it, in the lengthening intervals between his attacks of pain. Each time he asked for news of anyone, his father wondered what name would next come to his lips. Even during his delirium, he had mentioned no one but his parents, Mr. Brant, Adele Anthony, and Boylston. Yet it was not possible, Campton thought, that these formed the circumference of his life, that some contracted fold of memory did not hold a nearer image, a more secret name. The father's heart beat faster, half from curiosity, half from a kind of shy delicacy, at the thought that at any moment that name might wake in George and utter itself. Campton's thoughts again turned to his wife. With Julia there was never any knowing. 10 to 1 she would send the boy's temperature up. He was thankful that, owing to the difficulty of getting the news to her, and then of bringing her back from a frontier department, so many days had had to elapse. But when she arrived, nothing, after all, happened as he had expected. She had put on her nurse's dress for the journey. He thought it rather theatrical of her, till he remembered how much easier it was to get about in any sort of uniform. But there was not a trace of coquetry in her appearance. As a frame for her haggard, unpowdered face, the white coif looked harsh and unbecoming. She reminded him, as she got out of the motor, of some mortified Jansenist nun from one of Philippe de Champagne's canvases. Campton led her to George's door, but left her there. She did not appear to notice whether or not he was following her. He whispered, "Careful about his temperature. He's very weak." And she bent her profile silently as she went in. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. George, that evening, seemed rather better, and his temperature had not gone up, Campton had to repress a movement of jealousy at Julia's having done her son no harm. Her experience as a nurse, disciplining a vague gift for the sick room, had developed in her the faculty of self-command. Before the war, if George had met with a dangerous accident, she would have been more encumbering than helpful. Campton had to admit the change, but it did not draw them any nearer. Her manner of loving their son was too different. Nowadays, when he and Anderson Brandt were together, he felt that they were thinking of the same thing in the same way. But Julia's face, even aged and humanized by grief, was still a mere mask to him. He could never tell what form her thoughts about George might be taking. Mr. Brandt, on his wife's arrival, had judged it discreet to efface himself. Campton hunted for him in vain in the park and under the cloister. He remained invisible till they met at the early dinner which they shared with the staff. But the meal did not last long, and when it was over and nurses and doctors scattered, Mr. Brandt again slipped away, leaving his wife and Campton alone. Campton glanced after him, surprised. Why does he go? Mrs. Brandt pursed her lips, evidently as much surprised by his question as he by her husband's withdrawal. I suppose he's going to bed to be ready for his early start tomorrow. A start? She stared. He's going back to Paris. Campton was genuinely astonished. Is he? I'm sorry. Oh. She seemed unprepared for this. After all, you must see, we can't very well, all three of us, especially with these nuns. Oh, if it's only that. She did not take this up, and one of their usual silences followed. Campton was thinking that it was all nonsense about the nuns, and meditating on the advisability of going in pursuit of Mr. Brandt to tell him so. He dreaded the prospect of a long succession of days alone between George and George's mother. Mrs. Brandt spoke again. I was sorry to find that the sisters have been kept on here. Are they much with George? The sisters? I don't know. The upper nurses are Red Cross, as you saw. But of course the others are about a good deal. What's wrong? They seem to me perfect. She hesitated and colored a little. I don't want them to find out about the extreme unction, she finally said. Campton repeated her words blankly. He began to think that anxiety and fatigue had confused her mind. She colored more deeply. Oh, I forgot. You don't know. I couldn't think of anything but George at first, and the whole thing is so painful to me. Where's my bag? She groped for her reticule, found it in the folds of the cloak she had kept about her shoulders, and fumbled in it with wrinkled, jeweled fingers. Anderson hasn't spoken to you, then? Spoken about Mrs. Talcott? She asked suddenly. About Mrs. Talcott? Why should he? What on earth has happened? Oh, I wouldn't see her myself. I couldn't. So he had to. She had to be thanked, of course, but it seems to me so dreadful, so very dreadful. Our boy. That woman. Campton did not press her further. He sat dumbfounded, trying to take in what she was so obviously trying to communicate, and yet instinctively resisting the approach of the revelation he foresaw. George? Mrs. Talcott? He forced himself to couple the two names, unnatural as their union seemed. I suppose you knew. Isn't it dreadful? A woman old enough. She drew a letter from her bag. He interrupted her. Is that letter what you want to show me? Yes, she insisted on Anderson's keeping it, for you. She said it belonged to us, I believe. It seems there was a promise, made the night before he was mobilized, that if anything happened he would get a word to her. No thought of us. Campton reached out for the letter. Mrs. Talcott. Madge Talcott and George. That was where the boy had gone then, that last night when his father, left alone at the Crillon, had been so hurt by his desertion. That was the name which, in his hours of vigil in the little white room, Campton had watched for on his son's lips, the name which, one day, sooner or later, he would have to hear them pronounce. How little he had thought, as he sat studying the mysterious beauty of George's face, what a commonplace secret it concealed. The writing was not George's, but that of an unlettered French soldier. Campton, glancing at the signature, recalled it as that of his son's orderly, who had been slightly wounded in the same attack as George and sent for 24 hours to the same hospital at Doullens. He had been at George's side when he fell, and with a simple directness often natural to his class in France, he told the tale of his lieutenant's wounding, in circumstances which appeared to have given George great glory in the eyes of his men. They thought the wound mortal, but the orderly and a stretcher-bearer had managed to get the young man into the shelter of a little wood. The stretcher-bearer, it turned out, was a priest. He had at once applied the consecrated oil, and George, still conscious, had received it with a beautiful smile, Then the orderly, thinking all was over, had hurried back to the fighting and been wounded. The next day he too had been carried to Toulon, and there, after many inquiries, he had found his lieutenant in the same hospital, alive but too ill to see him. He had contrived, however, to see the nurse, and had learned from her that the doctors had not given up hope. With that he had to be content, but before returning to his base he had hastened to fulfill his lieutenant's instructions, given many months earlier, by writing to tell his lady that he was severely wounded but still alive, which is a good deal in itself, the orderly hopefully ended, not to mention his receiving the Legion of Honor. Campton laid the letter down. There was too much to be taken in all at once, and as usual in moments of deep disturbance, he wanted to be alone, above all wanted to be away from Julia. But Julia held him with insistent eyes. "Do you want this?" he asked finally, pushing the letter toward her. She recoiled. "Want it? A letter written to that woman? No. I should have returned it at once, but Anderson wouldn't let me. Think of her forcing herself upon me as she did, and making you paint her portrait. I see it all now. Had you any idea this was going on?" Campton shook his head and perceived by her look of relief that what she had resented above all was the thought of his being in a secret of George's from which she herself was excluded. "Adele didn't know either," she said, with evident satisfaction. Campton remembered that he had been struck by Miss Anthony's look of sincerity when he had asked her if she had any idea where George had spent his last evening, and she had answered negatively. This recollection made him understand Mrs. Brandt's feeling of relief. "Perhaps, after all, it's only a flirtation. A mere sentimental friendship," he hazarded. "A flirtation?" Mrs. Brandt's Mater Dolorosa face suddenly sharpened to worldly astuteness. "A sentimental friendship? Have you ever heard George mention her name or make any sort of allusion to such a friendship?" Campton considered. "No, I don't remember his ever speaking of her." "Well then." Her eyes had the irritated look he had seen on the far-off day when he had thrown Beausite's dinner invitation into the fire. Once more, they seemed to say, she had taken the measure of his worldly wisdom. George's silence, his care not even to mention that the Talcotts were so much as known to him, certainly made it look as though the matter went deep with him. Campton, recalling the tone of the Talcott drawing-room and its familiars, had an even stronger recoil of indignation than Julia's. But he was silenced by a dread of tampering with his son's privacy, a sense of the sacredness of everything pertaining to that still mysterious figure in the white bed upstairs. Mrs. Brandt's face had clouded again. "It's all so dreadful, and this extreme unction, too. What is it exactly? Do you know? A sort of baptism? Will the Roman Church try to get hold of him on the strength of it?" Campton remembered with a faint inward amusement that, in spite of her foreign bringing up and all her continental affinities, Julia had remained as implacably and incuriously Protestant as if all her life she had heard the Scarlet Woman denounced from Presbyterian pulpits. And another time it would have amused him to ponder on this one streak in her of the ancestral iron. But now he wanted only to console her. "Oh no, it was just the accident of the priests being there. One of our chaplains would have done the same thing." She looked at him mistrustfully. "The same kind of thing? It's never the same with them. Whatever they do reaches ahead. I've seen such advantage taken of the wounded when they were too weak to resist. Didn't know what they were saying or doing." Her eyes filled with tears. "A priest and a woman. I feel as if I'd lost my boy." The words went through Campton like a sword, and he sprang to his feet. "Oh, for God's sake, be quiet. Don't say it. What does anything matter but that he's alive?" Of course. I didn't mean, but that he should only think of her and not of us. That he should have deceived us. About everything. "Oh, don't say that either. Don't tempt Providence. If he deceived us, as you call it, we've no one but ourselves to blame, you and I. And Brandt. Didn't we all do our best to make him deceive us? With our intriguing and our wire-pulling and our cowardice? How he despised us for it. Yes, thank God, how he despised us from the first. He didn't hide the truth from Boylston or Adele, because they were the only two on a level with him. And they knew why he'd deceived us. They understood him. They abetted him from the first." He stopped, checked by Mrs. Brandt's pale, bewildered face, and the eyes imploringly lifted, as if to ward off unintelligible words. "Ah, well, all this is no use," he said. "We've got him safe, and it's more than we deserve." He laid his hand on her shoulder. Go to bed. You're dead beat. Only don't say things that might wake up the Furies. He pocketed the letter and went out in search of Mr. Brandt, followed by her gaze of perplexity. The latter was smoking a last cigar as he paced up and down the cloister with upturned coat collar. Silence lay on the carefully darkened building, crouching low under an icy sea fog. At intervals, through the hush, the waves continued to mimic the booming of guns. Campton drew out the orderly's letter. "I hear you're leaving tomorrow early, and I suppose I'd better give this back," he said. Mr. Brandt had evidently expected him. "Oh, thanks. But Mrs. Talcott says she has no right to it." "No right to it? That's a queer thing to say." "So I thought. I suppose she meant till you'd seen it. She was dreadfully upset till she saw me. She supposed he was dead." Campton shivered. "She sent this to your house?" Yes, the moment she got it. It was waiting there when Julia arrived." "And you went to thank her?" "Yes." Mr. Brandt hesitated. "Julia disliked to keep the letter, and I thought it only proper to take it back myself." "Certainly. And what was your impression?" Mr. Brandt hesitated again. He had already, Campton felt, reached the utmost limit of his power of communicativeness. It was against all his habits to commit himself. Finally, he said in an unsteady voice, "It was impossible not to feel sorry for her." "Did she say anything special? Anything about herself?" And "No, not a word. She was, well, all broken up, as they say." "Poor thing," Campton murmured. "Yes, oh yes." Mr. Brandt held the letter, turning it thoughtfully about. "It's a great thing," he began abruptly, as if the words were beyond his control, "to have such a beautiful account of the affair. George himself, of course, would never—" "No, never," Campton considered. "You must take it back to her naturally. But I should like to have a copy first." Mr. Brandt put a hand in his pocket. "I supposed you would, and I took the liberty of making two. Oh, privately, of course. I hope you'll find my writing fairly legible." He drew 2 folded sheets from his note case and offered one to Campton. "Oh, thank you." The 2 men grasped hands through the fog. Mr. Brandt turned to continue his round, and Campton went up to the whitewashed cell in which he was lodged. Screening his candle to keep the least light from leaking through the shutters, he reread the story of George's wounding, copied out in the cramped, tremulous writing of a man who never took pen in hand but to sign a daily batch of typed letters. The handmade copy of a letter by Mr. Brandt represented something like the pious toll expended by a monkish scribe on the page of a missal, and Campton was moved by the little man's devotion. As for the letter, Campton had no sooner begun to reread it than he entirely forgot that it was a message of love, addressed at George's request to Mrs. Talcott, and saw in it only the record of his son's bravery. And for the first time he understood that from the moment of George's wounding until now he had never really thought of him in relation to the war, never thought of his judgment on the war, of all the unknown emotions, resolves, and actions which had drawn him so many months ago from his safe shelter in the Argonne. These things Campton, unconsciously, had put out of his mind, or rather had lost out of his mind, from the moment when he had heard of George's wounding. By and by he knew the sense of them, and of the questions they raised, would come back and possess him. But meanwhile, emptied of all else, he brimmed with the mere fact of George's bodily presence, with the physical signs of him, his weakness, his temperature, the pain in his arm, the oppression on his lung, all the daily insistent details involved in coaxing him slowly back to life. The father could bear no more. He put the letter away as a man might put away something of which his heart was too full to measure. Later, yes. Now, all he knew was that his son was alive. But the hour of Campton's entering into glory came when, 2 or 3 days later, George asked with a sudden smile, "When I exchanged regiments, I did what you'd always hoped I would, eh, Dad?" It was the first allusion, on the part of either, to the mystery of George's transit from the Argonne to the front. At Toulon, he had been too weak to be questioned, and as he grew stronger and entered upon the successive stages of his convalescence, he gave the impression of having traveled far beyond such matters and of living his real life in some unconceivable region, from which, with that new smile of his, he continued to look down unseeingly on his parents. It's exactly as if he were dead, the father thought. And if he were, he might go on watching us with just such a smile. And then, one morning, as they were taking a few steps on a sunny terrace, Campton had felt the pressure of the boy's sound arm and caught the old George in his look. Good Lord, at any rate, I'm glad you felt sure of me, Campton could only stammer in reply. George laughed. Well, rather. There was a long silence full of sea murmurs, too drowsy and indolent for once to simulate the horror of the guns. I only wish you'd felt you could trust me about it from the first, as you did Adele and Boylston, the father continued. But, my dear fellow, I did feel it. I swear I did. Only you see there was Mother. I thought it all over and decided it would be easier for you both if I said nothing. And after all, I'm glad now that I didn't. That is, if you really do understand. Yes, I understand. That's jolly. George's eyes turned from his and rested with a joyful gravity on the little round-faced sister who hurried up to say that he'd been out long enough. Campton often caught him fixing this look of serene benevolence on the people who were gradually repeopling his world, a look which seemed to say that they were new to him, yet dimly familiar. He was like a traveler returning after incommunicable adventures to the place where he lived as a child. And, as this happens with such wanderers, the trivial and insignificant things, the things a newcomer would not have noticed, seemed often to interest him most of all. He said nothing more about himself, but with a look of recovered humanness which made him more lovable if less remotely beautiful, began to question his father. Boylston wrote that you'd begun to paint again. I'm glad. Oh, I only took it up for a while last spring. Portraits? A few, but I chucked it. I couldn't stand the atmosphere. What atmosphere? Of people who could want to be painted at such a time. People who wanted to secure a Campton. Oh, and then the dealers. God. George seemed unimpressed. After all, life's got to go on. Yes, that's what they say, and the only result is to make me doubt if theirs has. His son laughed, and then threw off. You did Mrs. Talcott? Yes, Campton snapped, off his guard. She's a pretty creature, said George, and at that moment his eyes, resting again on the little nurse, who was waiting at his door with a cup of cocoa, lit up with celestial gratitude. The communique's good today, she cried, and he smiled at her boyishly. The war was beginning to interest him again. Campton was sure that every moment he could spare from that unimaginable region, which his blue eyes guarded like a sword, was spent among his comrades at the front. As the day approached for the return to Paris, Campton began to penetrate more deeply into the meaning of George's remoteness. He himself, he discovered, had been all unawares in a far country, a country guarded by a winged sentry, as the old hymn had it, the region of silent, incessant communion with his son. Just they two, everything else effaced, not discarded, destroyed, nor disregarded even, but blotted out by a soft silver haze, as the brown slopes and distances were, on certain days, from the windows of the seaward gazing hospital. It was not that Campton had been unconscious of the presence of other suffering about them. As George grew stronger and took his first steps in the wards, he and his father were inevitably brought into contact with the life of the hospital. George had even found a few friends, and 2 or 3 regimental comrades, among the officers perpetually coming and going, or enduring the long weeks of agony which led up to the end. But that was only towards the close of their sojourn, when George was about to yield his place to others, and be taken to Paris for the re-education of his shattered arm. And by that time, the weeks of solitary communion had left such an imprint on Campton that, once the hospital was behind him and no more than a phase of memory, it became to him as one of its own sea mists, in which he and his son might have been peacefully shut away together from all the rest of the world. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff. Preparedness, cried Boylston in an exultant crow. His round brown face, with its curly crest and peering half-blind eyes, beamed at Campton in the old way across the desk of the Palais Royal office, and from the corner where she had sunk down on one of the broken springed divans, Adele Anthony echoed, "Preparedness." It was the first time that Campton had heard the word. but the sense of it had been in the air ever since he and George had got back to Paris. He remembered, on the very day of their arrival, noticing something different in both Boylston and Miss Anthony, and the change had shown itself in the same way. Both seemed more vivid, yet more remote. It had struck Campton in the moment of first meeting them, in the Paris hospital near the Bois de Boulogne, Fortin-Lecluse's old nursing home transformed into a house of re-education, to which George had been taken. In the little cell crowded with flowers, almost too many flowers, his father thought, for the patient's aching head and tired eyes, Campton, watching the entrance of the two visitors, the first to be admitted after Julia and Mr. Brandt, had instantly remarked the air they had of sharing something so secret and important that their joy at seeing George seemed only the overflow of another deeper joy. Their look had just such a vividness as George's own. As their glances crossed, Campton saw the same light in the eyes of all three, and now, a few weeks later, the clue to it came to him in Boylston's new word, preparedness. America, it appeared, had caught it up from east to west, in that sudden, incalculable way she had of flinging herself on a new idea. From the little group of discerning spirits, the contagion had spread like a prairie fire, sweeping away all the other catchwords of the hour, devouring them in one great blaze of wrath and enthusiasm. America meant to be prepared. First had come the creation of the training camp in Plattsburgh, for which, after long delays and much difficulty, permission had been wrung from a reluctant government. Then, as candidates flocked to it, as the whole young manhood of the eastern states rose to the call, other camps, rapidly planned, were springing up at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, at Fort Sheridan in Illinois, at the Presidio in California. For the idea was spreading through the West, and the torch kindled beside the Atlantic seaboard already flashed its light on the Pacific. For hours at a time, Campton heard Boylston talking about these training camps with the young Americans who helped him in his work, or dropped in to seek his counsel. More than ever, now, he was an authority and an oracle to these stray youths who were expending their enthusiasm for France in the humblest of philanthropic drudgery, students of the Beaux-Arts or the university, or young men of leisure discouraged by the indifference of their country and the dilatoriness of their government, and fired by the desire to take part in a struggle in which they had instantly felt their own government to be involved in spite of geographical distance. None of these young men had heard Benny Upsher's imperious call to be in it from the first, no matter how or at what cost. They were of the kind to wait for a lead, and now Boylston was giving it to them with his passionate variations on the great theme of preparedness. George, meanwhile, lay there in his bed and smiled, and now and then Boylston brought one or two of the more privileged candidates to see him. One day Campton found young Louis d'Estrée there, worn and haggard after a bad wound, and preparing to leave for America as instructor in one of the new camps. That seemed to bring the movement closer than ever, to bring it into their very lives. The thought flashed through Campton, when George is up, we'll get him sent out too. And once again a delicious sense of security crept through him. George, as yet, was only sitting up for a few hours a day. The wound in the lung was slow in healing, and his fractured arm in recovering its flexibility. But in another fortnight he was to leave the hospital and complete his convalescence at his mother's. The thought was bitter to Campton. He had heard all kinds of wild plans, of taking George to the Crillon, or hiring an apartment for him, or even camping with him at the studio. But George had smiled all this away. He meant to return to the Avenue Marigny, where he always stayed when he came to Paris, and where it was natural that his mother should want him now. Adele Anthony pointed out to Campton how natural it was, one day, as he and she left the Palais Royal together. They were going to lunch at a nearby restaurant, as they often did on leaving the office, and Campton had begun to speak of George's future arrangements. He would be well enough to leave the hospital in another week, and then, no doubt, a staff job could be obtained for him in Paris. With Brant's pull, you know, Campton concluded, hardly aware that he had uttered the detested phrase without even a tinge of irony. But Adele was aware, as he saw by the faint pucker of her thin lips. He shrugged her smile away indifferently. Oh, well, hang it, yes. Everything's changed now, isn't it? After what the boy's been through, I consider that we're more than justified in using Brant's pull in his favor, or anybody else's. Miss Anthony nodded and unfolded her napkin. Well then, Campton continued his argument, as he's likely to be in Paris now till the war is over, which means some time next year, they all say, why shouldn't I take a jolly apartment somewhere for the two of us? Those pictures I did last spring brought me in a lot of money, and there's no reason. His face lit up. Servants, you say? Why, my poor Mariette may be back from Lille any time now. They tell me there's sure to be a big push in the spring. They're saving up for that all along the line. Ask Dastre. Ask. You'd better let George go to his mother, said Miss Anthony concisely. Why? Because it's natural. It's human. You're not always, you know, she added with another pucker. Not human? I don't mean that you're inhuman, but you see things differently. I don't want to see anything but one, and that's my own son. How shall I ever see George if he's at the Avenue Marigny? He'll come to you. Yes, when he's not at Mrs. Talcott's. Miss Anthony frowned. The subject had been touched upon between them soon after Campton's return, but Miss Anthony had little light to throw on it. George had been as mute with her as with everyone else, and she knew Mrs. Talcott but slightly, and seldom saw her. Yet Campton perceived that she could not hear the young woman named without an involuntary contraction of her brows. I wish I liked her, she murmured. Mrs. Talcott? Yes. I should think better of myself if I did, and it might be useful, but I can't. I can't. Campton said within himself, Oh, women. For his own resentment had died out long ago. He could think of the affair now as one of hundreds such as happen to young men. He was even conscious of regarding it, in some unlit secret fold of himself, as a probable guarantee of George's wanting to remain in Paris, another subterranean way of keeping him, such should be needed. Perhaps that was what Miss Anthony meant by saying that her liking Mrs. Talcott might be useful. Why shouldn't he be with me? The father persisted. He and I were going off together when the war begun. I was defrauded of that. Why shouldn't I have him now? Miss Anthony smiled. Well, for one thing, because of that very pull you were speaking of. Oh, the Brants, the Brants. Captain glanced impatiently at the bill of fare, grumbled, Déjeuner du jour, I suppose, and went on. Yes, I might have known it. He belongs to them. From the minute we got back, and I saw them at the station, with their motor waiting, everything arranged as only money can arrange it, I knew I'd lost my boy again. He stared moodily before him, and yet if the war hadn't come, I should have got him back. I almost had. His companion still smiled, a little wistfully. She leaned over and laid her hand on his, under cover of the bill of fare. You did get him back, John, forever and always, the day he exchanged into the infantry. Isn't that enough? Campton answered her smile. You gallant old chap, you, he said, and they began to lunch. George was able to be up now, able to drive out and to see more people, and Campton was not surprised, on approaching his door a day or two later, to hear several voices in animated argument. The voices, and this did surprise him, were all men's. In one he recognized Boylston's deep round notes, but the answering voice, flat, toneless, and yet eager, puzzled him with a sense of something familiar but forgotten. He opened the door and saw, at the tea tray between George and Boylston, the smoothly brushed figure of Roger Talcott. Campton had not seen Mrs. Talcott's husband for months, and in the interval so much had happened that the young man, always somewhat faintly drawn, had become as dim as a daguerreotype held at the wrong angle. The painter hung back, slightly embarrassed, but Mr. Talcott did not seem in the least disturbed by his appearance or by the fact of himself being where he was. It was evident that, on whatever terms George might be with his wife, Mr. Talcott was determined to shed on him the same impartial beam as on all her other visitors. His eyeglasses glinted blandly up at Campton. "Now I dare say I am subversive," he began, going on with what he had been saying, but in a tone intended to include the newcomer. "I don't say I'm not. We are a subversive lot at home, all of us. You must have noticed that, haven't you, Mr. Campton?" Boylston emitted a faint growl. "What's that got to do with it?" he asked. Mr. Talcott's glasses slanted in his direction. "Why, everything. Resistance to the herd instinct, to borrow one of my wife's expressions, is really innate in me. And the idea of giving in now, of sacrificing my convictions, just because of all this deafening noise about America's danger and America's duties, well, no," said Mr. Talcott, straightening his glasses. "Philistinism won't go down with me, in whatever form it tries to disguise itself." Instinctively, he stretched a neat hand toward the teacups, as if he had been rearranging the furniture at one of his wife's parties. But, Boylston stuttered, red with rage. George burst into a laugh. He seemed to take a boyish amusement in the dispute. "Tea, father?" he suggested, reaching across the tray for a cigarette. Talcott jerked himself to his feet. "Take my chair. Now do, Mr. Campton. You'll be more comfortable. Here, let me shake up this cushion for you." "Cushion," Boylston interjected scornfully. "A light, George? Now don't move. I don't say, of course, old chap," Talcott continued, as he held the match deferentially to George's cigarette, "that this sort of talk would be safe, or advisable, just now in public. Subversive talk never is. But when 2 or 3 of the elect are gathered together, well, your father sees my point, I know. The hero," he nodded at George, "has his job, and the artist," with a slant at Campton, "his. In Germany, for instance, as we're beginning to find out, the creative minds, the intelligentsia, to use another of my wife's expressions, have been carefully protected from the beginning, given jobs, vitally important jobs, of course, but where their lives were not exposed. The country needs them too much in other ways. They would probably be wretched fighters, and they're of colossal service in their own line. Whereas in France and England," he suddenly seemed to see his chance. "Well, look here, Mr. Campton, I appeal to you. I appeal to the great creative artist. In any country but France and England, would a fellow of George's brains have been allowed, even at this stage of the war, to chuck an important staff job, requiring intellect, tact, and savoir-faire, and try to get himself killed like any unbaked boy, like your poor cousin Benny Upshur, for instance, would he?" "Yes, in America," shouted Boylston, and Mr. Talcott's tallowy cheeks turned pink. "George knows how I feel about these things," he stammered. George still laughed in his remote, impartial way, and Boylston asked with a grin, "Why don't you get yourself naturalized? A neutral?" Mr. Talcott's pinkness deepened. "I have lived too much among artists," he began, and George interrupted gaily. "There's a lot to be said on Talcott's side, too. Going, Roger? Well, I shall be able to look in on you now in a few days. Remember me to Madge. Goodbye." Boylston rose also, and Campton remained alone with his son. "Remember me to Madge." That was the way in which the modern young man spoke of his beloved to his beloved's proprietor. There had not been a shadow of constraint in George's tone, and now, glancing at the door which had closed on Mr. Talcott, he merely said, as if apostrophizing the latter's neat back, "Poor devil, he's torn to pieces with it." "With what?" asked Campton, startled. "Why, with Boylston's preparedness, wanting to do the proper thing, and never before having had to decide between anything more vital than straight or turned-down collars, is playing the very deuce with him." His eyes grew thoughtful. Was he going to pronounce Mrs. Talcott's name at last? But no, he wandered back to her husband. Poor little ass. Of course he'll decide against. He shrugged his shoulders. And Boylston's just as badly torn in the other direction. Boylston? Yes, knowing that he wouldn't be taken himself, on account of his bad heart and his blind eyes, and wondering if, in spite of his disabilities, he's got the right to preach to all these young chaps here who hang on his words like the gospel. One of them taunted him with it the other day. The cur. Yes, and ever since, of course, Boylston's been twice as fierce, and overworking himself to calm his frenzy. The men who can't go are all like that, when they know it's their proper work. It isn't everyone's billet out there. I've learnt that since I've had a look at it. But it would be Boylston's if he had the health, and he knows it, and that's what drives him wild. George looked at his father with a smile. You don't know how I thank my stars that there weren't any problems for me, but just a plain job that picked me up by the collar and dropped me down where I belonged. He reached for another cigarette. Old Adele's coming presently. Do you suppose we could rake up some fresh tea? He asked. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Lou in New York City. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 29. Coming out of the unlit, rainy March night, it was agreeable but almost startling to Campton to enter Mrs. Talcott's drawing room. In the softness of shaded lamplight against curtains closely drawn, young women dressed with extravagant elegance chatted with much decorated officers in the New Horizon uniform, with here and there among them an elderly civilian head, such as Harvey Mayhew's silvery thatch and the square, rapacious skull of the newly knighted patriot, Sir Cyril Jorgenstein. Campton had gone to Mrs. Talcott's that afternoon because she had lent her apartment to the Friends of French Art, who were giving a concert organized by Miss Anthony and Mademoiselle d'Avril, with Madame de Dolmetsch's pianist as their leading performer. It would have been ungracious to deprive the indefatigable group of the luster they fancied Campton's presence would confer, and he was not altogether sorry to be there. He knew that George had promised Miss Anthony to come, and he wanted to see his son with Mrs. Talcott. An abyss seemed to divide this careless throng of people, so obviously assembled for their own pleasure, the women to show their clothes, the men to admire them, from the worn, preoccupied audiences of the first war charity entertainments. The war still raged. Wild hopes had given way to dogged resignation. Each day added to the sum of public anguish and private woe. But the strain had been too long, the tragedy too awful. The idle and the useless had reached their emotional limit, and once more they dressed and painted, smiled, gossiped, flirted, as though the long agony were over. On a sofa stacked with orange velvet cushions, Madame de Dolmetsch reclined in a sort of serpent coil of flexible grey-green hung with strange amulets. Her eyes, in which fabulous islands seemed to dream, were fixed on the bushy-haired young man at the piano. Close by, upright and tight-waisted, sat the Marquise de Tranlay, her mourning veil thrown back from a helmet-like hat. She had planted herself in a Louis-Philippe armchair, as if appealing to its sturdy frame to protect her from the anarchy of Mrs. Talcott's furniture, and beside her was the daughter for whose sake she had doubtless come, a frowning beauty who, in spite of her dowdy dress and ugly boots, somehow declared herself as having already broken away from the maternal tradition. Madame de Tranlay's presence in that drawing-room was characteristic enough. It meant, how often one heard it nowadays, that mothers had to take their daughters wherever there was a chance of their meeting young men, and that such chances were found only in the few foreign houses, where discreetly Almost clandestinely, entertaining had been resumed. You had to take them there, Madame de Tranlay's look seemed to say, because they had to be married, the sooner the better in these wild times, with all the old barriers down, and because the young men were growing so tragically few, and the competition was so fierce, and because in such emergencies a French mother, whose first thought is always for her children, must learn to accept, even to seek, propinquities from which her inmost soul and all the ancestral souls within her would normally recoil. Campton remembered her gallant attitude on the day when, under her fresh crape, she had rebuked Mrs. Brandt's despondency. But how she hates it here! How she must loathe sitting next to that woman, he thought. And just then he saw her turn toward Madame de Dolmetsch with a stiff bend from the waist, and heard her say in her most conciliatory tone, "Your great friend, the rich American, chère Madame, the benefactor of France. We should so like to thank him, Claire and I, for all he is doing for our country." Beckoned to by Madame de Dolmetsch, Mr. Mayhew, all pink and silver and prominent pearl scarf pin, bowed before the Tranlay ladies, while the Marquise deeply murmured, "We are grateful. We shall not forget." And Mademoiselle de Tranlay, holding him with her rich gaze, added in fluent English, "Mamma hopes you'll come to tea on Sunday, with no one but my uncle, the Duc de Montlhéry, so that we may thank you better than we can here." Great women, Campton mused. He was still watching Madame de Tranlay's dauntless mask when her glance deserted the gratified Mayhew to seize on a younger figure. It was that of George, who had just entered. Madame de Tranlay, with a quick turn, caught Campton's eye, greeted him with her trenchant cordiality, and asked in a voice like the pounce of talons, "The young officer who has the Legion of Honor, the one you just nodded to, with reddish hair and his left arm in a sling? French, I suppose, from his uniform, and yet—" "Yes, the one talking to Mrs. Talcott. Can you tell me—" "My son," said Campton, with satisfaction. The effect was instantaneous, though Madame de Tranlay kept her radiant steadiness. "How charming, charming!" And after a proper interval, "But Claire, my child, we've not yet spoken to Mrs. Brandt, whom I see over there." And she steered her daughter swiftly toward Julia. Campton's eyes returned to his son. George was still with Mrs. Talcott, but they had only had time for a word or two before she was called away to seat an important dowager. In that moment, however, the father noted many things. George, as usual nowadays, kept his air of guarded kindliness, though the blue of his eyes grew deeper. But Mrs. Talcott seemed bathed in light. It was such a self-revelation that Campton's curiosity was lost in the artist's abstract joy. "If I could have painted her like that," he thought, reminded of having caught Madame de Dolmetsch transfigured by fear for her lover. But an instant later he remembered. "Poor little thing," he murmured. Mrs. Talcott turned her head as if his thought had reached her. Oh yes, come and let me tell you all about it." Her eyes entreated him, but Mayhew and Sir Cyril Jorgenstein were between them. "George," Mrs. Brandt called, and across the intervening groups Campton saw his son bowing to the Marquise de Tranlay. Madame de Dolmetsch jumped up, her bracelets jangling like a prompter's call. "Silence!" she cried. The ladies squeezed into their seats, the men resigned themselves to doorposts and window embrasures, and the pianist attacked Stravinsky. "Dancing?" Campton heard his hostess answering someone. "No, not quite yet, I think. Though in London already. Oh, just for the officers on leave, of course. Poor darlings, why shouldn't they? But today, you see, it's for a charity." Her smile appealed to her hearer to acknowledge the distinction. The music was over, and scanning the groups at the tea-tables, Campton saw Adèle and Mademoiselle d'Avril squeezed away in the remotest corner of the room. He took a chair at their table, and Boylston presently blinked his way to them through the crowd. They seemed, all four, more like unauthorized intruders on the brilliant scene than its laborious organizers. The entertainment, escaping from their control, had speedily reverted to its true purpose of feeding and amusing a crowd of bored and restless people, and the little group recognized the fact and joked over it in their different ways. But Mademoiselle d'Avril was happy at the sale of tickets, which must have been immense to judge from the crowd spying about the entrance. She had seen furious fine ladies turn away ticketless. And Adele Anthony was exhilarated by the nearness of people she did not know or wish to know, but with whose names and private histories she was minutely and passionately familiar. "That's the old Duchesse de Murol with Mrs. Talcott there. She's put her at the Beausite's table. Well, of all places! Ah, but you're all too young to know about Beausite's early history. And now, of course, it makes no earthly difference to anybody. But there must be times when Madame Beausite remembers and grins. Now that she's begun to rouge again, she looks 20 years younger than the Duchess. Ah," she broke off, abruptly signing to Campton. He followed her gaze to a table at which Julia Brant was seating herself with the Tranlay ladies and George. Mayhew joined them, nobly deferential, and the elder ladies lent him their intensest attention, isolating George with the young girl. Adele murmured, "not such a bad thing. They say the girl will have half of old Monterey's money. He's her mother's uncle, and she's heaps handsomer than the other. Not that that seems to count any more." Campton shrugged the subject away. Yes, it would be a good thing if George could be drawn from what his mother, with a retrospective pinching of the lips, called his wretched infatuation. But the idea that the boy might be coaxed into a marriage, and a rich marriage, by the Brants was even more distasteful to Campton. If he really loved Madge Talcott, better stick to her than let himself be cajoled away for such reasons. As the second part of the program began, Campton and Boylston slipped out together. Campton was oppressed and disturbed. "It's queer," he said, taking Boylston's arm to steer him through the dense darkness of the streets. "All these people who've forgotten the war have suddenly made me remember it." Boylston laughed. "Yes, I know." He seemed preoccupied and communicative, and the painter fancied he was going to lead the talk, as usual, to preparedness and America's intervention. But after a pause he said, "You haven't been much at the office lately." "No," Campton interrupted. "I've shirked abominably since George got back. But now that he's gone to the Brants, you'll see." "Oh, I didn't mean it as a reproach, sir. How could you think it?" "We're running smoothly enough as far as organization goes. That's not what bothers me." "You're bothered?" Yes, he was. And so, he added, was Miss Anthony. The trouble was, he went on to explain, that Mr. Mayhew, after months of total indifference, except when asked to represent them on official platforms, had developed a disquieting interest in the Friends of French Art. He had brought them in the beginning a certain amount of money, none of which came out of his own pocket, and in consequence had been imprudently put on the financial committee, so that he had a voice in the disposal of funds, though till lately he had never made it heard. But now, apparently, atrocities were losing their novelty, and he was disposed to transfer his whole attention to the Friends of French Art, with results which seemed incomprehensibly disturbing to Boylston, until he let drop the name of Madame de Dolmetsch. Campton exclaimed at it. "Well, yes, you must have noticed that she and Mr. Mayhew have been getting pretty chummy. You see, he's done such a lot of talking that people think he's at least an oil king, and Madame de Dolmetsch is dazzled, but she's got her musical prodigy to provide for." And Boylston outlined the situation which his astuteness had detected while it developed unperceived under Campton's dreaming eyes. Mr. Mayhew was attending all their meetings now, finding fault, criticizing, asking to have the accounts investigated, though they had always been audited at regular intervals by expert accountants. And all this zeal originated in the desire to put Madame de Dolmetsch in Miss Anthony's place, on the plea that her greater social experience, her gift of attracting and interesting, would bring in immense sums of money. Whereas, Boylston grimly hinted, they already had a large balance in the bank, and it was with an eye to that balance that Madame de Dolmetsch was forcing Mayhew to press her claim. "You see, sir, Mr. Mayhew never turns out to be as liberal as they expect when they first hear him talk. And though Madame de Dolmetsch has him in her noose, she's not getting what she wants, by a long way. And so they've cooked this up between them, she and Madame Beausite, without his actually knowing what they're after." Campton stopped short, releasing Boylston's arm. "But what you suggest is abominable," he exclaimed. "Yes, I know it." But the young man's voice remained steady. "Well, I wish you'd come to our meetings now you're back." I will, but I'm no earthly use on financial questions. You're much stronger there." He felt Boylston's grin through the darkness. "Oh, they'll have me out too before long." "You? Nonsense, what do you mean?" "I mean that lots of people are beginning to speculate in war charities. Oh, in all sorts of ways. Sometimes I'm sick to the point of chucking it all. But Miss Anthony keeps me going." "Ah, she would," Campton agreed. As he walked home, his mind was burdened by Boylston's warning. It was not merely the affair itself, but all it symbolized that made his gorge rise, made him, as Boylston said, sick to the point of wanting to chuck it all. To chuck everything connected with this hideous world that was dancing and flirting and money-making on the great red mounds of dead. He grinned at the thought that he had once believed in the regenerative power of war, the salutary shock of great moral and social upheavals. Yet he had believed in it, and never more intensely than at George's bedside at Doullens, in that air so cleansed by passion and pain that mere living seemed a meaningless gesture compared to the chosen surrender of life. But in the Paris to which he had returned, after barely 4 months of absence, the instinct of self-preservation seemed to have wiped all meaning from such words. Poor fatuous Mayhew dancing to Madame de Dolmetsch's piping, Jorgenstein sinking under the weight of his international honors, Madame de Tranlay intriguing to push her daughter in such society, and Julia placidly abetting her. Campton hardly knew from which of these sorry visions he turned with a more complete loathing. There were still the others, to be sure, the huge, obscure majority out there in the night, the millions giving their lives for this handful of trivial puppets, and here in Paris and everywhere in every country, men and women toiling unweariedly to help and heal. But in Mrs. Talcott's drawing-room, both fighters and toilers seemed to count as little in relation to the merrymakers as Miss Anthony and Mademoiselle d'Avril in relation to the brilliant people who had crowded their table into the obscurest corner of the room. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Lou in New York City. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 30. These thoughts continued to weigh on Campton. To shake them off, he decided, with one of his habitual quick jerks of resolution, to get back to work. He knew that George would approve, and would perhaps be oftener with him if he had something interesting on his easel. Sir Cyril Jorgenstein had suggested that he would like to have his portrait finished, with the Legion of Honor added to his lapel, no doubt. And Harvey Mayhew, rosy and embarrassed, had dropped in to hint that if Campton could find time to do a charcoal head, just one of those brilliant sketches of his, of the young musical genius in whose career their friend Madame de Dolmetsch was so much interested. But Campton had cut them both short. He was not working, he had no plans for the present, and in truth he had not thought even of attempting a portrait of George. The impulse had come to him once as he sat by the boy's bed, but the face was too incomprehensible. He should have to learn and unlearn too many things first. At last, one day, it occurred to him to make a study of Madame Lebel. He saw her in charcoal. Her simple, unquestioning anguish had turned her old face to sculpture. Campton set his canvas on the easel and started to shout for her down the stairs, but as he opened the door he found himself face to face with Mrs. Talcott. "Oh," she began at once, in her breathless way. "You're here. The old woman downstairs wasn't sure, and I couldn't leave all the money with her, could I?" "Money? What money?" he echoed. She was very simply dressed, and a veil drooping low from her hat brim gave to her overeager face a shadowy, youthful calm. "I may come in?" she questioned, almost timidly. And as Campton let her pass, she added, "The money from the concert, of course. Heaps and heaps of it. I'd no idea we'd made so much, and I wanted to give it to you myself." She shook a bulging bag out of her immense muff, while Campton continued to stare at her. "I didn't know you went out so early," he finally stammered, trying to push a newspaper over the disordered remains of his breakfast. She lifted interrogative eyebrows. "That means that I'm in the way?" "No, but why did you bring the money here?" She looked surprised. "Why not? Aren't you the head, the real head of the committee? And wasn't the concert given in my house?" Her eyes rested on him with renewed timidity. "Is it disagreeable to you to see me?" she asked. "Disagreeable? My dear child, no." He paused, increasingly embarrassed. What did she expect him to say next? To thank her for having sent him the orderly's letter? It seemed to him impossible to plunge into the subject uninvited. Surely it was for her to give him the opening, if she wished to. "Well, no," she broke out. "I've never once pretended to you, have I? The money's a pretext. I wanted to see you here alone, with no one to disturb us." Campton felt a confused stirring of relief and fear. All his old dread of scenes, commotions, disturbing emergencies, of anything that should upset his perpetually vibrating balance, was blent with the passionate desire to hear what his visitor had to say. It was good of you to think of sending us that letter," he faltered. She frowned in her anxious way and looked away from him. "Afterward I was afraid you'd be angry." "Angry? How could I?" He groped for a word. "Surprised, yes. I knew nothing about you, and not even that it was I who bought the sketch of him, the one that Léonce Black sold for you last year." The blood rushed to Campton's face. Suddenly he felt himself trapped and betrayed. "You? You've got that sketch?" The thought was somehow intolerable to him. "Ah, now you are angry," Mrs. Talcott murmured. No, but I never imagined." "I know, that was what frightened me, your suspecting nothing." She glanced about her, dropped to a corner of the divan, and tossed off her hat with the old familiar gesture. "Oh, can I talk to you?" she pleaded. Campton nodded. "I wish you'd light your pipe then, and sit down too." He reached for his pipe, struck a match, and slowly seated himself. "You always smoke a pipe in the morning, don't you? He told me that." She went on, then she paused again and drew a long, anxious breath. "Oh, he's so changed. I feel as if I didn't know him any longer. Do you?" Campton looked at her with deepening wonder. This was more surprising than discovering her to be the possessor of the picture. He had not expected deep to call unto deep in their talk. "I'm not sure that I do," he confessed. Her fidgeting eyes deepened and grew quieter. "Your saying so makes me feel less lonely," she sighed, half to herself. "But has he told you nothing since he came back? Really nothing?" "Nothing. After all, how could he? I mean, without indiscretion." "Indiscretion? Oh!" She shrugged the word away with half a smile, as though such considerations belonged to a prehistoric order of things. "Then he hasn't even told you that he wants me to get a divorce?" "A divorce!" Campton exclaimed. He sat staring at her as if the weight of his gaze might pin her down, keep her from fluttering away and breaking up into luminous splinters. George wanted her to get a divorce, wanted, therefore, to marry her. His passion went as deep for her as that. Too deep, Campton conjectured, for the poor little ephemeral creature who struck him as wriggling on it like a butterfly impaled. "Please tell me," he said at length, and suddenly, in short, inconsequent sentences, the confession poured from her. George, it seemed, during the previous winter in New York, when they had seen so much of each other, had been deeply attracted, had wanted everything, and at once, and there had been moments of tension and estrangement when she had been held back by scruples she confessed she no longer understood, inherited prejudices, she supposed. And when her reluctance must have made her appear to be trifling, whereas, really, it was just that she couldn't. So they had gone on for several months with the usual emotional ups and downs, till he had left for Europe to join his father. And when they had parted, she had given him the half-promise that if they met abroad during the summer, she would perhaps, after all. Then came the war. George had been with her during those few last hours in Paris, and had dined with her and her husband. Had Campton forgiven her? The night before, he was mobilized. And then, when he was gone, she had understood that only timidity, vanity, the phantom barriers of old terrors and traditions had prevented her being to him all that he wanted. She broke off abruptly, put in a few conventional words about an ill-assorted marriage, and never having been really understood. And then, as if guessing that she was on the wrong tack, jumped up, walked to the other end of the studio, and turned back to Campton with the tears running down her ravaged face. And now he says he won't have me," she lamented. "Won't have you? But you tell me he wants you to be divorced." She nodded, wiped away the tears, and in so doing stole an unconscious glance at the mirror above the divan. Then, seeing that the glance was detected, she burst into a sort of sobbing laugh. "My nose gets so dreadfully red when I cry," she stammered. Campton took no notice, and she went on. "A divorce, yes, and unless I agree to marry him, we're never to be anything but friends." "That's what he says?" "Yes. Oh, we've been all in and out of it 100 times." She pulled out a gold mesh bag and furtively restored her complexion, as Mrs. Brandt had once done in the same place. Campton sat still, considering. He had let his pipe go out. Nothing could have been farther from the revelation he had expected, and his own perplexity was hardly less great than his visitor's. Certainly it was not the way in which young men had behaved in his day, nor, evidently, had it been George's before the war. Finally he made up his mind to put the question. "And Talcott?" She burst out at once. "Ah, that's what I say. It's not so simple." "What isn't?" "Breaking up all one's life." She paused with a deepening embarrassment. "Of course Roger has made me utterly miserable. But then I know he hasn't really meant to." "Have you told George that?" "Yes, but he says we must first of all be above board. He says he sees everything differently now. That's what I mean when I say that I don't understand him. He says love's not the same kind of feeling to him that it was. There's something of Meredith's that he quotes. I wish I could remember it. Something about a mortal lease." "Good Lord," Campton groaned, not so much at the hopelessness of the case as at the hopelessness of quoting Meredith to her. After a while he said abruptly, "You must forgive my asking, but things change sometimes. They change imperceptibly. Do you think he's as much in love with you as ever?" He had been half afraid of offending her, but she appeared to consider the question impartially and without a shadow of resentment. "Sometimes I think more, because in the beginning it wasn't meant to last. And now, if he wants to marry me, oh, I wish I knew what to do." Campton continued to ponder. "There's one more question, since we're talking frankly. What does Talcott know of all this?" She looked frightened. "Oh, nothing. And you've no idea how he would take it?" She examined the question with tortured eyebrows, and at length, to Campton's astonishment, brought out, "Magnificently." "He'd be generous, you mean? But it would go hard with him?" "Oh, dreadfully, dreadfully." She seemed to need the assurance to restore her shaken self-approval. Campton rose with a movement of pity and laid his hand on her shoulder. "My dear child, if your husband cares for you, give up my son." Her face fell and she drew back. "Oh, but you don't understand, not in the least. It's not possible. It's not moral. You know, I'm all for the new morality. First of all, we must be true to self." She paused and then broke out. "You tell me to give him up because you think he's tired of me, but he's not. I know he's not. It's his new ideas that you don't understand any more than I do. It's the war that has changed him. He says he wants only things that last, that are permanent, things that hold a man fast, that sometimes he feels as if he were being swept away on a flood and were trying to catch at things, at anything, as he's rushed along under the waves. He says he wants quiet, monotony, to be sure the same things will happen every day. When we go out together, he sometimes stands for a quarter of an hour and stares at the same building, or at the Seine under the bridges. But he's happy, I'm sure. I've never seen him happier, only it's in a way I can't make out." "Oh, my dear, if it comes to that, I'm not sure that I can. Not sure enough to help you, I'm afraid." She looked at him, disappointed. "You won't speak to him, then?" "Not unless he speaks to me." "Ah, he frightens you, just as he does me." She pulled her hat down on her troubled brow, gathered up her furs, and took another sidelong peep at the glass. Then she turned toward the door. On the threshold she paused and looked back at Campton. "Don't you see," she cried, "that if I were to give George up, he'd get himself sent straight back to the front?" Campton's heart gave an angry leap. For a second he felt the impulse to strike her, to catch her by the shoulders and bundle her out of the room. With a great effort he controlled himself and opened the door. "You don't understand. You don't understand," she called back to him once again from the landing. Madge Talcott had asked him to speak to his son. He had refused, and she had retaliated by planting that poisoned shaft in him. But what had retaliation to do with it? She had probably spoken the simple truth, and with the natural desire to enlighten him. If George wanted to marry her, it must be, since human nature, though it might change its vocabulary, kept its instincts, it must be that he was very much in love, and in that case her refusal would in truth go hard with him, and it would be natural that he should try to get himself sent away from Paris. From Paris, yes, but not necessarily to the front. After such wounds and such honors, he had only to choose. A staff appointment could easily be got, or, no doubt, with his 2 languages, he might, if he preferred, have himself sent on a military mission to America. With all this propaganda talk, wasn't he the very type of officer they wanted for the neutral countries? It was Campton's dearest wish that George should stay where he was. He knew his peace of mind would vanish the moment his son was out of sight. But he suspected that George would soon weary of staff work, or of any form of soldiering at the rear, and try for the trenches if he left Paris. Whereas, in Paris, Madge Talcott might hold him, as she had meant his father to see. The first thing, then, was to make sure of a job at the War Office. Campton turned and tossed like a sick man on the hard bed of his problem. To plan, to scheme, to plot and circumvent, nothing was more hateful to him. There was nothing in which he was less skilled. If only he dared to consult Adele Anthony. But Adele was still incorrigibly warlike, and her having been in George's secret while his parents were excluded from it left no doubt as to the side on which her influence would bear. She loved the boy, Campton sometimes thought, even more passionately than his mother did. But how did the old song go? She loved honor, or her queer conception of it, more. Ponder as he would, he could not picture her, even now, lifting a finger to keep George back. Campton struggled all the morning with these questions. After lunch he pocketed Mrs. Talcott's money-bag and carried it to the Palais Royal, where he discovered Harvey Mayhew in confabulation with Madame Beausite, who still trailed her ineffectual beauty about the office. The painter thought he detected a faint embarrassment in the glance with which they both greeted him. "Hello, Campton. Looking for our good friend Boylston? He's off duty this afternoon, Madame Beausite tells me. As he is pretty often in these days, I've noticed." Mr. Mayhew sardonically added, "In fact, the office has rather been left to run itself lately, eh? Of course, our good Miss Anthony is absorbed with her refugees, gives us but a divided allegiance, and Boylston, well, young men, of course it's been a weary pull for him. By the way, my dear fellow," Mr. Mayhew continued, as Campton appeared about to turn away, "I called at Mrs. Talcott's just now to ask for the money from the concert. A good round sum, I hear it is, and she'd told me she'd given it to you. Have you brought it with you? If so, Madame Beausite here would take charge of it." Madame Beausite turned her great resigned eyes on the painter. "Mr. Campton knows I'm very careful. I will lock it up till his friends return. Now that Mr. Boylston is so much away, I very often have such responsibilities." Campton's eyes returned her glance, but he did not waver. "Thanks so much, but as the sum is rather large, it seems to me the bank's the proper place. Will you please tell Boylston I've deposited it?" Mr. Mayhew's benevolent pink turned to an angry red. For a moment Campton thought he was about to say something foolish, but he merely bent his head stiffly, muttered a vague phrase about irregular proceedings, and returned to his seat by Madame Beausite's desk. As for Campton, his words had decided his course. He would take the money at once to Bullard and Brandt's and seize the occasion to see the banker. Mr. Brandt was the only person with whom, at this particular juncture, he cared to talk of George. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 31. Mr. Brandt's private office was as glitteringly neat as when Campton had entered it for the first time and seen the fatal telegram about Benny Upshur marring the order of the desk. Now he crossed the threshold with different feelings. To have Mr. Brandt look up and smile, to shake hands with him, accept one of his cigars, and sink into one of the blue leather armchairs seemed to be in the natural order of things. He felt only the relief of finding himself with the one person likely to understand. "About George," he began. "Yes," said Mr. Brandt briskly. "It's curious. I was just thinking of looking you up. It's his birthday next Tuesday, you know." "Oh," said the father, slightly put off. He had not come to talk of birthdays, nor did he need to be reminded of his son's by Mr. Brandt. He concluded that Mr. Brandt would be less easy to get on with in Paris than at the front. "And we thought of celebrating the day by a little party, a dinner, with perhaps the smallest kind of a dance. Or just bridge. Yes, probably just bridge," the banker added tentatively. "Opinions differ as to the suitability. It's for his mother to decide. But of course, no evening clothes, and we hoped perhaps to persuade you. Our only object is to amuse him, to divert his mind from this wretched entanglement." It was doubtful if Mr. Brandt had ever made so long a speech, except perhaps at a board meeting, and then only when he read the annual report. He turned pink and stared over Campton's shoulder at the panelled white wall on which a false Reynolds hung. Campton meditated. The blush was the blush of Mr. Brandt, but the voice was the voice of Julia. Still, it was probable that neither husband nor wife was aware how far matters had gone with Mrs. Talcott. "George is more involved than you think," Campton said. Mr. Brandt looked startled. "In what way?" He means to marry her. He insists on her getting a divorce." "A divorce? Good gracious," murmured Mr. Brandt. He turned over a jade paper cutter, trying its edge absently on his nail. "Does Julia—" he began at length. Campton shook his head. "No, I wanted to speak to you first." Mr. Brandt gave his quick bow. He was evidently gratified, and the sentiment stimulated his faculties, as it had when he found that Campton no longer resented his presence at the hospital. His small, effaced features took on a businesslike sharpness, and he readjusted his eyeglasses and straightened the paper cutter, which he had put back on the desk a fraction of an inch out of its habitual place. "You had this from George?" he asked. "No, from her. She's been to see me. She doesn't want to divorce. She's in love with him, in her way, that is. But she's frightened." "And that makes him the more eager?" "The more determined, at any rate." Mr. Brandt appeared to seize the distinction. "George can be very determined. Yes, I think his mother ought to be made to understand that all this talk about a wretched entanglement isn't likely to make him any less so." Mr. Brandt's look seemed to say that making Julia understand had proved a no less onerous task for his maturity than for Campton's youth. "If you don't object, perhaps the matter might, for the present, continue to be kept between you and me," he suggested. "Oh, by all means. What I want," Campton pursued, "is to get him out of this business altogether. They wouldn't be happy, they couldn't be. She's too much like—" He broke off, frightened at what he had been about to say. "Too much," he amended, "like the usual fool of a woman that every boy of George's age thinks he wants simply because he can't get her." "And you say she came to you for advice?" "She came to me to persuade him to give up the idea of a divorce. Apparently she's ready for anything, short of that. It's a queer business. She seems sorry for Talkett, in a way." Mr. Brandt marked his sense of the weight of this by a succession of attentive nods. He put his hands in his pockets, leaned back, and tilted his dapper toes against the gold-trellised scrap basket. The attitude seemed to change the pale paneling of his background into a glass and mahogany Wall Street office. "Won't he be satisfied with, all the rest, so to speak, since you say she offers it?" "No, he won't. There's the difficulty. It seems it's the new view, the way the young men feel since the war. He wants her for his wife, nothing less." "Ah, he respects her," murmured Mr. Brandt, impressed. And Campton reflected that he had no doubt respected Julia. "And what she wants is to get you to persuade him to accept less?" "Well, something of the sort." Mr. Brandt sat up and dropped his heels to the floor. "Well then, don't!" he snapped. "Don't?" "Persuade her, on the contrary, to keep him hoping, to make him think she means to marry him. Don't you see?" Mr. Brandt exclaimed almost impatiently. "Don't you see that if she turns him down definitely, he'll be scheming to get away, to get back to the front the minute his leave is over? Tell her that. Appeal to her on that ground. Make her do it. She will if she's in love with him, and we can't stop him from going back. Not one of us. He's restless here already, I know that. Always talking about his men, saying he's got to get back to them. The only way is to hold him by this girl. She's the very influence we need." He threw it all out in sharp, terse phrases, as a businessman might try to hammer facts about an investment into the bewildered brain of an impractical client. Campton felt the blood rising to his forehead, not so much in anger at Mr. Brandt as at the sense of his own inward complicity. "There's no earthly reason why George should ever go back to the front," he said. "None whatever. We can get him any staff job he chooses. His mother's already got the half-promise of a post for him at the War Office. But you'll see, we can't stop him. Did we before? There's only this woman who can do it." Campton looked over the banker's head at the reflection of the false Reynolds in the mirror. That anyone should have been fool enough to pay a big price for such a patent fraud seemed to him as incomprehensible as his own present obtuseness seemed to the banker. "You do see, don't you?" argued Mr. Brant anxiously. "Oh, I suppose so." Campton slowly got to his feet. The adroit brushwork of the forged picture fascinated him, and he went up to look at it more closely. Mr. Brant pursued him with a gratified glance. "Ah, you're admiring my Reynolds. I paid a thumping price for it, but that's always my principle. Pay high, but get the best. It's a better investment." "Just so," Campton assented dully. Mr. Brant seemed suddenly divided from him by the whole width of the gulf between that daub on the wall and a real Reynolds. They had nothing more to say to each other, nothing whatever. "Well, good-bye." He held out his hand. "Think it over, think it over," Mr. Brant called out after him as he enfiladed the sumptuous offices, a medalled veteran holding back each door. It was not until Campton was back at Montmartre and throwing off his coat to get into his old studio clothes that he felt in his pocket the weight of the forgotten concert money. It was too late in the day to take it back to the bank, even if he had had the energy to retrace his steps, and he decided to hand the bag over to Boylston, with whom he was dining that night to meet the elder Dastry, home on a brief leave from his ambulance. Think it over. Mr. Brant's adjuration continued to echo in Campton's ears, as if he needed to be told to think it over. Once again the war-worn world had vanished from his mind, and he saw only George, himself and George in safety, George in peace. They blamed women who were cowards about their husbands, mistresses who schemed to protect their lovers. Well, he was as bad as any one of them, if it came to that. His son had bought his freedom, had once offered his life and nearly lost it. Brant was right. At all costs they must keep him from rushing back into that hell. That Mrs. Talcott should be the means of securing his safety was bitter enough. This trivial, barren creature to be his all, it seemed the parody of Campton's own youth. And Julia, after all, had been only a girl when he had met her, inexperienced and still malleable. A man less absorbed in his art, less oblivious of the daily material details of life, might conceivably have made something of her. But this little creature, with her farrago of false ideas, her vanity, her restlessness, her undisguised desire to keep George and yet not lose her world, had probably reached the term of her development and would trip on through an eternal infancy of fads and frenzies. Luckily, as Mr. Brant said, they could use her for the time, use her better, no doubt, than had she been a more finely tempered instrument. Campton was still pondering on these things as he set out for the restaurant where he had agreed to meet Boylston and Dastry. At the foot of his own stairs he was surprised to run against Boylston under the porte-cochere. They gave each other a quick, questioning look, as men did when they encountered each other unexpectedly in those days. "Anything up?" "Oh, the money. You've come for the money." Campton remembered that he had left the bag upstairs. "The money? Haven't you heard? Louis Dastry's killed," said Boylston. They stood side by side in the doorway, while Campton's darkened mind struggled anew with the mystery of fate. Almost every day now the same readjustment had to be gone through. The cowering, averted mind dragged upward and forced to visualize a new gap in the ranks, and summon the remaining familiar figures to fill it up and blot it out. And today this cruel gymnastic was to be performed for George's best friend, the elder Dastry's sole stake in life. Only a few days ago the lad had passed through Paris, just back from America, and in haste to rejoin his regiment, alive and eager, throbbing with ideas, with courage, mirth, and irony, the very material France needed to rebuild her ruins and beget her sons. And now, struck down as George had been, not to rise like George. Once more the inner voice in Campton questioned distinctly, "Could you bear it?" And again he answered, "Less than ever." Aloud he asked, "Paul?" "Oh, he went off at once, to break the news to Louis's mother in the country." The boy was all Paul had left. Yes. What difference would it have made in the war if he just stayed on at his job in America? Boylston did not answer, and the two stood silent, looking out unseeingly at the black, empty street. There was nothing left to say, nowadays, when such blows fell, hardly anything left to feel, it sometimes seemed. "Well, I suppose we must go and eat something," the older man said, and arm in arm they went out into the darkness. When Campton returned home that night, he sat down and, with the help of several pipes, wrote a note to Mrs. Talkett, asking when she would receive him. Thereafter he tried to go back to his painting and to continue his daily visits to the Palais Royal office. But for the time nothing seemed to succeed with him. He threw aside his study of Madame Lebel. He hung about the office, confused and idle, and with the ever-clearer sense that there also things were disintegrating. George's birthday party had been given up on an account of young Dastrey's death. Mrs. Brant evidently thought the postponement unnecessary. Since George's return, she had gone over heart and soul to the business-as-usual party. But Mr. Brant quietly sided with George, and Campton was glad to be spared the necessity of celebrating the day in such a setting. It was some time since Campton had seen his son, but the fault was not his son's. The painter was aware of having voluntarily avoided George. He said to himself, "As long as I know he's safe, why should I bother him?" But in reality he did not feel himself to be fit company for anyone, and had even shunned poor Paul Dastrey on the latter's hurried passage through Paris when he had come back from carrying the fatal news to young Dastrey's mother. What on earth could Paul and I have found to say to each other? Campton argued with himself. For men of our age there's nothing left to say nowadays. The only thing I can do is try to work up one of my old studies of Louis. That might please him a little, later on. But after one or two attempts he pushed away that canvas too. At length one afternoon George came in. They had not met for over a week, and as George's blue uniform detached itself against the blurred tapestries of the studio, the north light modeling the fresh curves of his face, the father's heart gave a leap of pride. His son had never seemed to him so young and strong and vivid. George, with a sudden blush, took his hand in a long pressure. "I say, Dad, Madge has told me that you know about us and that you've persuaded her to see things as I do. She hadn't had a chance to speak to me of your visit till last night." Campton felt his color rising, but though his own part in the business still embarrassed him, he was glad that the barriers were down. "I didn't want," George continued, still flushed and slightly constrained, "to say anything to you about all this till I could say, 'Here's my wife, and now she's promised.'" "She's promised?" "Thanks to you, you know. Your visit to her did it. She told me the whole thing yesterday. How she'd come here in desperation to ask you to help her, to have her mind cleared up for her, and how you'd thought it all over and then gone to see her, and how wise and perfect you'd been about it all. Poor child, if you knew the difference it's made to her." They were seated now, the littered table between them. Campton, his elbows on it, his chin on his hands, looked across at his son, who faced the light. "The difference to you too?" he questioned. George smiled. It was exactly the same detached smile which he used to shed on the little nurse who brought him his cocoa. "Of course, now I can go back without worrying." He let the words fall as carelessly as if there were nothing in them to challenge attention. "Go back?" Campton stared at him with a blank countenance. Had he heard aright? The noise of a passing lorry suddenly roared in his ears like the guns of the front. "Did you say go back?" George opened his blue eyes wide. "Why, of course, as soon as ever I'm patched up. You didn't think—" "I thought you had the sense to realize that you've done your share in one line and that your business now is to do it in another." The same detached smile again brushed George's lips. "But if I happen to have only one line? Nonsense. You know they don't think that at the War Office." "I don't believe the War Office will shut down if I leave it." "What an argument! It sounds like—" Campton, breaking off on a sharp breath, closed his lids for a second. He'd been gazing too steadily into George's eyes, and now at last he knew what that mysterious look in them meant. It was Benny Upsher's look, of course. inaccessible to reason, beyond reason, belonging to other spaces, other weights and measures, over the edge somehow of the tangible, calculable world. A man can't do more than his duty. You've done that, he growled. But George insisted, with his gentle obstinacy, you'll feel differently about it when America comes in. Campton shook his head. Never about your case. You will, when you see how we all feel. When we're all in it, you wouldn't have me looking on, would you? And then there are my men. I've got to get back to my men. But you've no right to go now, no business, his father broke in violently, persuading that poor girl to wreck her life and then leaving her, planting her there with her past ruined and her future. George, you can't. George, in his long months of illness, had lost his old ruddiness of complexion. At his father's challenge, the blood again rose the more visibly to his still gaunt cheeks and white forehead. He was evidently struck. You'll kill her and kill your mother, Campton stormed. Oh, it's not for tomorrow, not for a long time, perhaps. My shoulder's still too stiff. I was stupid, the young man haltingly added, to put it as I did. Of course I've got to think of Madge now, he acknowledged, as well as mother. The blood flowed slowly back to Campton's heart. You've got to think of just the mere common sense of the thing. That's all I ask. You've done your turn. You've done more. But never mind that. Now it's different. You're barely patched up. You're of use, immense use for staff work, and you know it. And you've asked a woman to tie up her future to yours. At what cost, you know too. It's as much your duty to keep away from the front now as it was before. Well, I admit it, to go there. You've done just what I should have wanted my son to do, up to this minute. George laid a hand on his a little wistfully. Then just go on trusting me. I do, to see that I'm right. If I can't convince you, ask Boylston, ask Adele. George sat staring down at the table. For the first time since they met at Doulin's, Campton was conscious of reaching his son's inner mind and of influencing it. I wonder if you really love her, he suddenly risked. The question did not seem to offend George, scarcely to surprise him. Of course, he said simply. Only, well, everything's different nowadays, isn't it? So many of the old ideas have come to seem such humbug. That's what I want to drag her out of, the coils and coils of stale humbug. They were killing her. Well, take care you don't, Campton said, thinking that everything was different indeed, as he recalled the reasons young men had had for loving and marrying in his own time. A faint look of amusement came into George's eyes. Kill her? Oh, no. I'm gradually bringing her to life. But all this is hard to talk about, yet. By and by, you'll understand. She'll show you. We'll show you together. But at present nothing's to be said to anyone, please, not even to Mother. Madge thinks this is no time for such things. There, of course, I don't agree, but I must be patient. The secrecy, the underhandedness are hateful to me, but for her, it's all a part of the sacred humbug. He rose listlessly, as if the discussion had bled all the life out of him, and took himself away. When he had gone, his father drew a deep breath. Yes, the boy would stay in Paris. He would almost certainly stay, for the present, at any rate. And people were still prophesying that in the spring there would be a big push all along the line, and after that the nightmare might be over. Campton was glad he had gone to see Madge Talkett. He was glad, above all, that if the thing had to be done, it was over, and that, by Madge's wish, no one was to know of what had passed between them. It was a distinct relief, in spite of what he had suggested to George, not to have to carry that particular problem to Adele Anthony or Boylston. A few days later, George accepted a staff appointment in Paris. End of chapter 31. Recording by Riley McGuire. Chapter 32 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 32. Heavily the weeks went by. The world continued to roar on through smoke and flame, and contrasted with that headlong race was the slow, dragging lapse of hours and days to those who had to wait on events inactively. When Campton met Paul Dastrey for the first time after the death of the latter's nephew, the two men exchanged a long hand clasp and then sat silent. As Campton had felt from the first, there was nothing left for them to say to each other. If young men like Louis Dastrey must continue to be sacrificed by hundreds of thousands to save their country, for whom was the country being saved? Was it for the wasp-waisted youths in sham uniforms who haunted the reawakening hotels and restaurants in the frequent intervals between their ambulance trips to safe distances from the front? Or for the elderly men like Dastrey and Campton, who could only sit facing each other with the spectre of the lost between them? Young Dastrey, young Fortin-Lescluze, René Devril, Benny Upshur, and how many hundreds of more each day, and not even a child left by most of them, to carry on the faith they had died for. If we're giving all we care for so that those little worms can reopen their dance halls on the ruins, what in God's name is left? Campton questioned. Dastrey sat looking at the ground, his grey head bent between his hands. France, he said. What's France, with no men left? Well, I suppose an idea. Yes, I suppose so. Campton stood up heavily. An idea. They must cling to that. If Dastrey, from the depths of his destitution, could still feel it and live by it, why did it not help Campton more? An idea. That was what France, ever since she had existed, had always been in the story of civilization. A luminous point about which striving visions and purposes could rally. And in that sense, she had been as much Campton's spiritual home as Dastrey's. To thinkers, artists, to all creators, she had always been a second country. If France went, Western civilization went with her, and then all they had believed in and been guided by would perish. That was what George had felt. It was what had driven him from the Argonne to the Aisne. Campton felt it too, but dully, through a fog. His son was safe, yes, but too many other men's sons were dying. There was no spot where his thoughts could rest. There were moments when the sight of George, intact and immaculate, his arm at last out of its sling, rose before his father like a reproach. The feeling was senseless, but there it was. Whenever the young man entered the room, Campton saw him attended by the invisible host of his comrades, the fevered, the maimed, and the dying. The Germans had attacked at Verdun. Horrible daily details of the struggle were pouring in. No one at the rear had really known, except in swift, fitful flashes, about the individual suffering of the first months of the war. Now such information was systematized and distributed everywhere, daily, with a cold, impartial hand. And every night, when one laid one's old bones on one's bed, there were those others, the young in their thousands, lying down, perhaps never to rise again, in the mud and blood of the trenches. Even Boylston's preparedness was beginning to get on Campton's nerves. He tried to picture to himself how he should exult when his country at last fell into line, but he could realize only what his humiliation would be if she did not. It was almost a relief at this time to have his mind diverted to the dissensions among the Friends of French Art, where, at a stormy meeting, Harvey Mayhew, as a member of the Finance Committee, had asked for an accounting of the money taken in at Mrs. Talcott's concert. This money, Mr. Mayhew stated, had passed through a number of hands. It should have been taken over by Mr. Boylston, as treasurer at the close of the performance, but he had failed to claim it, had, in fact, been unfindable when the organizers of the concert brought their takings to Mrs. Talcott, and the money, knocking about from hand to hand, had finally been carried by Mrs. Talcott herself to Mr. Campton. The latter, when asked to entrust it to Mr. Mayhew, had refused on the ground that he had already deposited it in the bank, but a number of days later it was known to be still in his possession. All this time Mr. Boylston, treasurer and chairman of the financial committee, appeared to think it quite in order that the funds should have been, as he assumed, deposited in the bank by a member who was not on that particular committee, and who, in reality, had forgotten that they were in his possession. Mr. Mayhew delivered himself of this indictment amid an embarrassed silence. To Campton it had seemed as if a burst of protest must instantly clear the air. But after he himself had apologized for his negligence in not depositing the money, and Boylston had disengaged his responsibility in a few quiet words, there followed another blank interval. Then Mr. Mayhew suddenly suggested a complete reorganization of the work. He had something to criticize in every department. He, who so seldom showed himself at the office, now presented a list of omissions and commissions against which one after another of the active members rose to enter a mild denial. It was clear that someone belonging to the organization, and who was playing into his hands, had provided him with a series of cleverly falsified charges against the whole group of workers. Presently Campton could stand it no longer, and, jumping up, suddenly articulate, he flung into his cousin's face a handful of home truths under which he expected that glossy countenance to lose its luster. But Mr. Mayhew bore the assault with urbanity. It did not behoove him, he said, to take up the reproaches addressed to him by the most distinguished member of their committee. The most distinguished, he might surely say, without offense to any of the others. A murmur of assent. It did not behoove him, because one of the few occasions on which a great artist may be said to be at a disadvantage is when he is trying to discuss business matters with a man of business. He, Mr. Mayhew, was only that, nothing more, but he was that, and he had been trained to answer random abuse by hard facts. In no way did he intend to reflect on the devoted labors of certain ladies of the committee, nor on their sympathetic treasurer's gallant efforts to acquire, amid all his other pressing interests, the rudiments of business habits. But Miss Anthony had all along been dividing her time between two widely different charities, and Mr. Boylston, like his distinguished champion, was first of all an artist, with the habits of the studio rather than of the office. In the circumstances, Campton jumped to his feet again. If he stayed a moment longer, he felt he should knock Mayhew down. He jammed his hat on, shouted out, "I resign," and limped out of the room. It was the way in which his encounters with practical difficulties always ended. The consciousness of his inferiority in argument, the visionary's bewilderment when incomprehensible facts are thrust on him by fluent people, the helpless sense of not knowing what to answer, and of seeing his dream world smashed in the rough and tumble of shabby motives, it all gave him the feeling that he was drowning, and must fight his way to the surface before they had him under. In the street he stood in a cold sweat of remorse. He knew the charges of negligence against Miss Anthony and Boylston were trumped up. He knew there was an answer to be made, and that he was the man to make it, and his eyes filled with tears of rage and self-pity at his own incompetence. But then he took heart at the thought of Boylston's astuteness and Miss Anthony's courage. They would not let themselves be beaten. Probably they would fight their battle better without him. He tried to protect his retreat with such arguments, and when he got back to the studio he called up Madame Lebel, and plunged again into his charcoal study of her head. He did not remember having ever worked with such supernatural felicity. It was as if that were his victorious answer to all their lies and intrigues. But the Mayhew party was victorious too. How it came about a mind like Campton's could not grasp. Mr. Mayhew, it appeared, had let fall that a very large gift of money from the world-renowned philanthropist, Sir Cyril Jorgenstein, obtained through the good offices of Mesdames de Dolmetsch and Beausite, was contingent on certain immediate changes in the organization. Drastic changes was Mr. Mayhew's phrase, and thereupon several hitherto passive members had suddenly found voice to assert the duty of not losing this gift. After that the way was clear. Adele Anthony and Boylston were offered ornamental posts which they declined, and within a week the Palais Royal saw them no more, and Paris drawing-rooms echoed with the unusual rumors of committee wrangles and dark discoveries. The episode left Campton with a bitter taste in his soul. It seemed to him like an ugly little allegory of Germany's maneuvering the world into war. The speciousness of Mr. Mayhew's arguments, the sleight of hand by which he had dislodged the real workers and replaced them by his satellites, reminded the painter of the neutrals who were beginning to say that there were two sides to every question, that war was always cruel, and how about the Russian atrocities in Silesia? As the months dragged on, a breath of lukewarmness had begun to blow through the world, dampening men's souls, confusing plain issues, casting a doubt on the worth of everything. People were beginning to ask what one knew, after all, of the secret motives which had impelled half a dozen self-indulgent old men ensconced in ministerial offices to plunge the world in ruin. No one seemed to feel any longer that life is something more than being alive. Apparently, the only people not tired of the thought of death were the young men still pouring out to it in their thousands. Still, those thousands poured. Still, the young died. Still, wherever Campton went, he met elderly faces, known and unknown, disfigured by grief, shrunken with renunciation. And still the months wore on without result. One day, in crossing the Tuileries, he felt the same soft sparkle which, just about a year earlier, had abruptly stirred the sap in him. Yes, it was nearly a year since the day when he had noticed the first horse-chestnut blossoms and been reminded by Madame Lebel that he ought to buy some new shirts. And though today the horse-chestnuts were still leafless, they were already misty with buds, and the tall white clouds above them full-uddered with spring showers. It was spring again, spring with her deluding promises, her gilding of worn stones and chilly water, the mystery of her distances, the finish and brilliance of her nearer strokes. Campton, in spite of himself, drank down the life-giving draught and felt its murmur in his veins. And just then, across the width of the gardens, he saw, beyond a stretch of turf and clipped shrubs, two people, also motionless, who seemed to have the same cup at their lips. He recognized his son and Mrs. Talkett. Their backs were toward him, and they stood close together, looking with the same eyes at the same sight, an Apollo touched with flying sunlight. After a while they walked on again, slowly and close to each other. George, as they moved, seemed now and then to point out some beauty of sculpture, or the color of a lichened urn, and once they turned and took their fill of the great perspective tapering to the arch on which Rude's Maenad Marseillaise still yelled her battalions on to death. End of chapter 32. Recording by Riley McGuire. Chapter 33 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 33. Campton finished his charcoal of Madame Lebel. Then he attacked her in oils. Now that his work at the Palais Royal was ended, painting was once more his only refuge. Adele Anthony had returned to her refugees. Boylston, pale and obstinate, toiled on at preparedness. But Campton found it impossible to take up any new form of work. His philanthropic ardor was exhausted. He could only shut himself up for long solitary hours in the empty and echoing temple of his art. George emphatically approved of his course. George was as insistent as Mrs. Brant on the duty of business as usual. But on the young man's lips the phrase had a different meaning. It seemed the result of that altered perspective which Campton was conscious of whenever, nowadays, he tried to see things as his son saw them. George was not indifferent, he was not callous, but he seemed to feel himself mysteriously set apart, destined to some other task for which he was passively waiting. Even the split among the friends of French art left him, despite of his admiration for Boylston, curiously unperturbed. He seemed to have taken the measure of all such ephemeral agitations, and to regard them with an indulgent pity which was worse than coldness. "He feels that all we do is so useless," Campton said to Dastry. "He's like a gardener watching ants rebuild their hill in the middle of a path, and knowing all the while that hill and path are going to be wiped out by his pick." "Ah, they're all like that," Dastry murmured. Madame Labelle came up to the studio every afternoon. The charcoal study had been only of her head, but for the painting Campton had seated her in her own horsehair armchair, her smoky lamp beside her, her sewing in her lap. More than ever he saw in the wise old face something typical of its race and class, the obstinate French gift, as someone had put it, of making one more effort after the last effort. The old woman could not imagine why he wanted to paint her, but when one day he told her it was for her grandsons, her eyes filled, and she said, "For which one, sir? For they're both at Verdun." One autumn afternoon he was late in getting back to the studio, where he knew she was waiting for him. He pushed the door open, and there, in the beaten-down attitude in which he had once before seen her, she lay across the table, her cap awry, her hands clutching her sewing, and George kneeling at her side. The young man's arm was about her, his head pressed against her breast, and on the floor lay the letter, the fatal letter which was always, nowadays, the key to such scenes. Neither George nor the old woman had heard Campton enter, and for a moment he stood and watched them. George's face, so fair and ruddy against Madame Labelle's rusty black, wore a look of boyish compassion which Campton had never seen on it. Madame Labelle had sunk into his hold as if it soothed and hushed her, and Campton said to himself, "These two are closer to each other than George and I, because they've both seen the horror face to face. He knows what to say to her ever so much better than he knows what to say to his mother or me." But apparently there was no need to say much. George continued to kneel in silence. Presently he bent and kissed the old woman's cheek. Then he got to his feet and saw his father. "The Chasseur Alpin," he merely said, picking up the letter and handing it to Campton. It was the grandson she counted on most. Madame Labelle caught sight of Campton, smoothed herself, and stood up also. "I had found him a wife, a strong, healthy girl with a good dot. There go my last great-grandchildren, for the other will be killed too. I don't understand any more, do you?" She made an automatic attempt to straighten the things on the table, but her hands beat the air, and George had to lead her downstairs. It was that day that Campton said to himself, "We shan't keep him in Paris much longer." But the heavy weeks of spring and summer passed, the inconclusive conflict at the front went on with its daily toll of dead, and George still stuck to his job. Campton, during this time, continued to avoid the Brants as much as possible. His wife's conversation was intolerable to him. Her obtuse optimism, now that she had got her son back, was even harder to bear than the guiltily averted glance of Mr. Brant, between whom and Campton their last talk had hung a lasting shadow of complicity. But most of all Campton dreaded to meet the Talketts. The wife with her flushed cheekbones and fixed eyes, the husband still affably and continuously arguing against Philistinism. One afternoon the painter stumbled on them, taking tea with George in Boylston's little flat, but he went away again, unable to bear the interminable discussion between Talkett and Boylston and the pacifist's reiterated phrase, "to borrow one of my wife's expressions," while George, with a closed, brooding face, sat silent, laughing dryly now and then. What a different George from the one his father had found, in silence also, kneeling beside Madame Lebel. Once again Campton was vouchsafed a glimpse of that secret George. He had walked back with his son after the funeral mass for young Lebel, and in the porter's lodge of the Avenue Marigny they found a soldier waiting, a young square-built fellow with a shock of straw-colored hair above his sunburnt rural face. Campton was turning from the door when George dashed past him, caught the young man by both shoulders, and shouted out his name. It was that of the orderly who had carried him out of the firing line and hunted him up the next day at the Doullens hospital. Campton saw the look the two exchanged. It lasted only for the taking of a breath. A moment later, officer and soldier were laughing like boys, and the orderly was being drawn forth to shake hands with Campton. But again the glance was an illumination. It came straight from that far country, the Benny Upshur country, which Campton so feared to see in his son's eyes. The orderly had been visiting his family, fugitives from the invaded regions who had taken shelter in one of Adele Anthony's suburban colonies. He had obtained permission to stop in Paris on his way back to the front, and for 2 joyful days he was lodged and feasted in the Avenue Marigny. Boylston provided him with an evening at Montmartre. George and Mrs. Brant took him to the theatre and the cinema, and on the last day of his leave Adele Anthony invited him to tea with Campton, Mr. Brant, and Boylston. Mr. Brant, as they left this entertainment, hung back on the stairs to say in a whisper to Campton, "The family are provided for, amply. I've asked George to mention the fact to the young man, but not until just as he's starting." Campton nodded. For George's sake he was glad, yet he could not repress a twinge of his dormant jealousy. Was it always to be Brant who thought first of the things to make George happy? Always Brant who would alone have the power to carry them out? "But he can't prevent that poor fellow's getting killed tomorrow," Campton thought, almost savagely, as the young soldier beamed forth from the taxi in which George was hurrying him to the station. It was not many days afterward that George looked in at the studio early one morning. Campton, over his breakfast, had been reading the communiqué. There was heavy news from Verdun. From east to west the air was dark with calamity. But George's face had the look it had worn when he greeted his orderly. "Dad, I'm off," he said, and sitting down at the table he unceremoniously poured himself some coffee into his father's empty cup. "The battalion's been ordered back. I leave tonight. Let's lunch together somewhere presently, shall we?" His eye was clear, his smile confident. A great weight seemed to have fallen from him, and he looked like the little boy sitting up in bed with his Lavengro. "After 10 months of Paris," he added, stretching his arms over his head with a great yawn. "Yes, the routine," stammered Campton, not knowing what he said. Yet he was glad, too. Yes, in his heart of hearts he knew he was glad, though, as always happened, his emotion took him by the throat and silenced him. But it did not matter, for George was talking. I shall have leave a good deal oftener nowadays," he said with animation. "And everything is ever so much better organized. Letters and all that. I shan't seem so awfully far away. You'll see." Campton still gazed at him, struggling for expression. Their hands met. Campton said, or imagined he said, "I see. I do see, already," though afterward he was not even sure that he had spoken. What he saw with an almost blinding distinctness was the extent to which his own feeling during the long months had imperceptibly changed, and how his inmost impulse, now that the blow had fallen, was not of resistance to it, but of acquiescence, since it made him once more one with his son. He would have liked to tell that to George, but speech was impossible. And perhaps, after all, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because George understood. Their hand clasp had made that clear, and an hour or two later they were lunching together, almost gaily. Boylston joined them, and the three went on together to say goodbye to Adele Anthony. Adele, for once, was unprepared. It was almost a relief to Campton, who had winced in advance at the thought of her warlike attitude. The poor thing was far from warlike. Her pale eyes clung to George's in a frightened stare, while her lips, a little stiffly, repeated the stock phrases of good cheer. "Such a relief! I congratulate you. Getting out of all the paperasserie and red tape. If I'd been you, I couldn't have stood Paris another minute. The only hopeful people left are at the front." It was the formula that sped every departing soldier. The day wore on. To Campton, its hours seemed as interminable yet as rapid as those before his son's first departure, nearly 2 years earlier. George had begged his father to come in the evening to the Avenue Marigny, where he was dining with the Brants. It was easier for Campton nowadays to fall in with such requests. During the months of George's sojourn in Paris, a good many angles had had their edges rubbed off. Besides, at that moment, he would have done anything for his son again at last. In their hand-clasp that morning the old George had come back to him, simple, boyish, just as he used to be, and Campton's dread of the future was lightened by a great glow of pride. In the Avenue Marigny dining-room, the Brants and George were still sitting together about the delicate silver and porcelain. There were no flowers. Julia, always correct, had long since banished them as a superfluity. But there was champagne for George's farewell, and a glimpse of rich fare being removed. Mr. Brant rose to greet Campton. His concise features were drawn with anxiety and with the effort to hide it. But his wife appeared to Campton curiously unperturbed, and the leave-taking was less painful and uselessly drawn out than he had expected. George and his father were to be sent to the station in Mr. Brant's motor. Campton, as he got in, remembered with a shiver the grey morning before daylight when the same motor had stood at the studio door, waiting to carry him to Doullens. Between himself and his son he seemed to see Mr. Brant's small, suffering profile. To shake off the memory, he said, "Your mother's in wonderfully good form. I was glad to see she wasn't nervous." George laughed. "No, Madge met her this morning at the New Clairvoyance. It does them all a lot of good," he added with his all-embracing tolerance. Campton shivered again. That universal smiling comprehension of George's always made him seem remoter than ever. "It makes him seem so old, 1,000 years older than I am." But he forced an acquiescent laugh, and presently George went on. "About Madge. You'll be awfully good to her, won't you, if I get smashed?" "My dear boy!" There was another pause, and then Campton risked a question. "Just how do things stand? I know so little, after all." For a moment George seemed to hesitate. His thick, fair eyebrows were drawn into a puzzled frown. "I know. I've never explained it to you properly. I've tried to, but I was never sure that I could make you see." He paused and added quietly, "I know now that she'll never divorce Talcott." "You know?" Campton exclaimed with a great surge of relief. She thinks she will, but I see that the idea still frightens her, and I've kept on using the divorce argument only as a pretext. The words thrust Campton back into new depths of perplexity. A pretext? He echoed. My dear old dad, don't you guess? She's come to care for me awfully. If we'd gone all the lengths she wanted, and then I'd got killed, there would have been nothing on earth left for her. I hadn't the right, don't you see? We chaps haven't any futures to dispose of till this job we're in is finished. Of course, if I come back and she can make up her mind to break with everything she's used to, we shall marry. But if things go wrong, I'd rather leave her as she is, safe in her little old rut. So many people can't live out of one, and she's one of them, poor child, though she's so positive she isn't. Campton sat chilled and speechless as the motor whirled them on through the hushed streets. It paralyzed his faculties to think that in a moment more they would be at the station. "It's awfully fine, your idea," he stammered at last. "Awfully magnanimous." But he still felt the chill down his spine. "Oh, it's only that things look to us so different, so indescribably different, and always will, I suppose, even after this business is over. We seem to be sealed to it for life." Poor girl, Campton thought within himself. Aloud he said, "My dear chap, of course you can count on my being, my doing." Of course, old dad." They were at the station. Father and son got out and walked toward the train. Campton put both hands on George's shoulders. "Look here," George broke out, "there's one thing more. I want to tell you that I know what a lot I owe to you and Adele. You've both been awfully fine. Did you know it? You two first made me feel a lot of things I hadn't felt before. And you know this is my job. I've never felt surer of it than at this minute." They clasped hands in silence, each looking his fill of the other. Then the crowd closed in. George exclaimed, "My kit bag!" And somehow, in the confusion, the parting was over, and Campton, straining blurred eyes, saw his son smile, the smile of the light-hearted lad of old days, flash out at him from the moving train. For an instant the father had the illusion that it was the goodbye look of the boy George going back to school after the holidays. Campton, as he came out of the station, stumbled, to his surprise, on Mr. Brant. The little man, as they met, flushed and paled, and sought the customary support from his eyeglasses. "I followed you in the other motor," he said, looking away. "Oh, I say," Campton murmured. Then with an effort, "Shouldn't you like me to drive back with you?" Mr. Brant shook his head. Thank you very much. But it's late and you'll want to be getting home. I'll be glad if you'll use my car." Together they strolled slowly across the station court to the place where the private motors waited. But there Campton held out his hand. "Much obliged. I think I'll walk." Mr. Brant nodded. Then he said abruptly, "This clairvoyant business, is there anything in it, do you think? You saw how calm, Julia was just now. She wished me to tell you that Spanish woman she goes to, her name is Olida, I think, had absolutely assured her about the future. The woman says she knows that George will come back soon and never be sent to the front again. Those were the exact words, I believe. Never to be sent to the front again. Julia put every kind of question and couldn't trip her up. She wanted me to tell you so. It does sound... Well, at any rate, it's a help to the mothers." End of chapter 33. Recording by Riley McGuire. Chapter 34 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 34. The next morning Campton said to himself, "I can catch that goodbye look if I get it down at once," and pulled out a canvas before Madame Labelle came in with his coffee. As sometimes happened to him, the violent emotions of the last 24 hours had almost immediately been clarified and transmuted into vision. He felt that he could think contentedly of George if he could sit down at once and paint him. The picture grew under his feverish fingers, feverish, yet how firm. He always wondered anew at the way in which, at such hours, the inner flame and smoke issued in a clear, guiding radiance. He saw, and the mere act of his seeing seemed to hold George safe in some pure, impenetrable medium. His boy was there, sitting to him, the old George he knew and understood essentially, vividly, face to face with him. He was interrupted by a ring. Madame Labelle, tray in hand, opened the door, and a swathed and voluminous figure, sweeping in on a wave of musk, blotted her out. Campton, exasperated at the interruption, turned to face Madame Olida. So remote were his thoughts that he would hardly have recognized her had she not breathed on the old familiar guttural "Juanito." He was less surprised at her intrusion than annoyed at being torn from his picture. "Didn't you see a sign on the door? No admission before 12, he growled. "Oh yes," she said. "That's how I knew you were in." "But I'm not in. I'm working. I can't allow—" Her large bosom rose. "I know, my heart. I remember how stern you always were. Work, work, my work. It was always that, even in the first days. But I come to you on my knees. Juanito, imagine me there." She sketched a plunging motion of her vast body, arrested it in time by supporting herself on the table, and threw back her head entreatingly, so that Campton caught a glint of the pearls in a crevasse of her quaking throat. He saw that her eyes were red with weeping. "What can I do? You're in trouble?" "Oh, such trouble, my heart, such trouble!" She leaned to him, absorbing his hands in her plump, muscular grasp. "I must have news of my son. I must. The young man. You saw him that day you came with your wife? Yes, he looked in at the door. Beautiful as a god, was he not? That was my son Pepito." And with a deep breath of pride and anguish, she unburdened herself of her tale. 2 or 3 years after her parting with Campton, she had married a clever French barber from the Pyrenees. He had brought her to France, and they had opened a beauty shop at Biarritz and had prospered. Pepito was born there, and soon afterward, alas, her clever husband, declaring that he hated grease in cooking or in woman, and after my Pepito's birth I became as you now see me, had gone off with the manicure and all their savings. Madame Olida had had a struggle to bring up her boy, but she had kept on with the beauty shop, had made a success of it, and not long before the war had added fortune-telling to massage and hairdressing. "And my son, Juanito, was not my son an advertisement for your beauty shop, I ask you? Before he was out of petticoats he brought me customers. Before he was 16 all the ladies who came to me were quarreling over him. Ah, there were moments when he crucified me. But lately he had grown more reasonable, had begun to see where his true interest lay, and we had become friends again, friends and business partners. When the war broke out I came to Paris. I knew that all the mothers would want news of their sons. I have made a great deal of money, and I have had wonderful results, wonderful. I could give you instances, names that you know, where I have foretold everything. Oh, I have the gift, my heart, I have it." She pressed her hands with a smile of triumph, then her face clouded again. "But 6 months ago my darling was called to his regiment, and for 3 months now I've had no news of him, none, none." She sobbed, the tears making dark streaks through her purplish powder. The upshot of it was that she had heard that Campton was all-powerful, that he knew ministers and generals, knew great financiers like Jorgenstein, who were so much more powerful than either generals or ministers, and could, if he chose, help her to trace her boy, who from the day of his departure for the front had vanished as utterly as if the earth had swallowed him. Not a word, not a sign, to me, his mother, who have slaved and slaved for him, who have made a fortune for him. Campton looked at her, marveling. "But your gift, as you call it, your powers, you can't use them for yourself?" She returned his look with a tearful simplicity. She hardly seemed to comprehend what he was saying. "But my son! I want news of my son, real news. I want a letter. I want to see someone who has seen him, to touch a hand that has touched him. Oh, don't you understand?" "Yes, I understand," he said, and she took up her desperate litany, clinging about him with soft palms like Medusa lips, till by dint of many promises he managed to detach himself and steer her gently to the door. On the threshold she turned to him once more. "And your own son, Juanito? I know he's at the front again. His mother came the other day. She often comes. And I can promise you things if you'll help me. No, even if you don't help me. For the old days' sake, I will. I know secrets, magical secrets that will protect him. There's a Moorish salve, infallible against bullets, handed down from King Solomon. I can get it." Campton, guiding her across the sill, let her out and bolted the door on her. Then he went back to his easel and stood gazing at the sketch of George. But the spell was broken. The old George was no longer there. The war had sucked him back into its awful whirlpool. Once again he was that dark enigma, a son at the front. In the heavy weeks which followed, a guarded illusion of Campton showed him one day that Boylston was aware of there being something between George and Madge Tackett. Not that he's ever said anything, or even encouraged me to guess anything, but she's got a talking face, poor little thing, and not much gift of restraint. And I suppose it's fairly obvious to everybody, except perhaps to Tackett, that she's pretty hard hit. Yes, and George? Boylston's round face became remote and mysterious. "We don't really know, do we, sir, exactly how any of them feel, any more than if they were—" He drew up sharply on the word, but Campton faced it. "Dead?" "Transfigured, say. No, what's the word in the theology books? A new substance, somehow." "Ah, you feel that too?" the father exclaimed. "Yes. They don't know it themselves, though, how far they are from us. At least, I don't think they do." Campton nodded. "But George, in the beginning, was frankly indifferent to the war, wasn't he?" "Yes, intellectually he was. But he told me that when he saw the first men on their way back from the front, with the first mud on them, he knew he belonged where they'd come from. I tried hard to persuade him when he was here that his real job was on a military mission to America. And it was. Think what he might have done out there. But it was no use. His orderly's visit did the trick. It's the thought of their men that pulls them all back. Look at Louis Dastry. They couldn't keep him in America. There's something in all their eyes. I don't know what. Dulce et decorum, perhaps. Yes. There was a pause before Campton questioned. "And Tackett?" "Poor little ass, I don't know. He's here arguing with me nearly every day." She looks over his shoulder and just shrugs at me with her eyebrows. "Can you guess what she thinks of George's attitude?" "Oh, something different every day. I don't believe she's ever really understood. But then she loves him, and nothing else counts." Mrs. Brand continued to face life with apparent serenity. She had returned several times to Madame Olida's and had always brought away the same reassuring formula. She thought it striking, and so did her friends, that the clairvoyant's prediction never varied. There was reason to believe that George's regiment had been sent to Verdun, and from Verdun the news was growing daily more hopeful. This seemed to Mrs. Brand a remarkable confirmation of Olida's prophecy. Apparently it did not occur to her that, in the matter of human life, victories may be as ruinous as defeats, and she triumphed in the fact, it had grown to be a fact to her, that her boy was at Verdun, where he might have been in the Somme, where things, though stagnant, were on the whole going less well. Mothers prayed for a quiet sector, and then, she argued, what happened? The men grew careless, the officers were oftener away, your son was ordered out to see to the repairs of a barbed wire entanglement, and a sharpshooter picked him off while you were sitting reading one of his letters and thinking, 'Thank God he's out of the fighting.' And besides, Olida was sure, and all her predictions had been so wonderful." Campton began to dread his wife's discovering Madame Olida's fears for her own son. Every endeavor to get news of Pepito had been fruitless. Finally, Campton and Boylston concluded that the young man must be a prisoner. The painter had a second visit from Madame Olida, in the course of which he besought her, without naming Julia, to be careful not to betray her private anxiety to the poor women who came to her for consolation, and she fixed her tortured velvet eyes on him reproachfully. "How could you think it of me, Juanito? The money I earn is for my boy. That gives me the strength to invent a new lie every morning." He took her fraudulent hand and kissed it. The next afternoon he met Mrs. Brandt walking down the Champs-Élysées with her light, girlish step. She lifted a radiant face to his. "A letter from George this morning. And, do you know, Olida prophesied it. I was there again yesterday, and she told me that he would soon be back, and that at that very moment she could see him writing to me. You'll admit it's extraordinary. So many mothers depend on her. I couldn't live without her. And her messages from her own son are so beautiful." "From her own son?" "Yes, didn't I tell you? He says such perfect things to her. And she confessed to me, poor woman, that before the war he hadn't always been kind. He used to take her money and behave badly. But now every day he sends her a thought message. Such beautiful things. She says she wouldn't have the courage to keep us all up if it weren't for the way that she's kept up by her boy. And now," Julia added gaily, "I'm going to order the cakes for my bridge tea this afternoon. You know I promised Georgie I wouldn't give up my bridge teas." Now and then Campton returned to his latest portrait of his son. But in spite of George's frequent letters, in spite of the sudden drawing together of father and son during their last moments at the station, the vision of the boy George, the careless, happy George who had ridiculed the thought of war and pursued his millennial dreams of an enlightened world, that vision was gone. Sometimes Campton fancied that the letters themselves increased this effect of remoteness. They were necessarily more guarded than the ones written before George's wounding from an imaginary HQ. But that did not wholly account for the difference. Campton, in the last analysis, could only say that his vision of his boy was never quite in focus. Either, as in the moment when George had comforted Madame Lebel, or greeted his orderly, or when he had said those last few broken words at the station, he seemed nearer than ever, seemed part in substance of his father, or else he became again that beautiful, distant apparition, the winged sentry guarding the unknown. The weeks thus punctuated by private anxieties rolled on dark with doom. At last, in December, came the victory of Verdun. Men took it reverentially, but soberly. The price paid had been too heavy for rejoicing, and the horizon was too ominous in other quarters. Campton had hoped that the new year would bring his son back on leave, but still George did not speak of coming. Meanwhile, Boylston's face grew rounder and more beaming. At last America was stirring in her sleep. "Oh, if only George were out there!" Boylston used to cry, as if his friend had been an army. His faith in George's powers of persuasion was almost mystical. And not long afterward Campton had the surprise of a visit which seemed, in the most unforeseen way, to confirm this belief. Returning to his studio one afternoon, he found it tenanted by Mr. Roger Talkett. The young man, as carefully brushed and equipped as usual, but pale with emotion, clutched the painter's hand in a moist grasp. "My dear master, I had to see you alone, and immediately." Campton looked at him with apprehension. What was the meaning of his "alone"? Had Mrs. Talkett lost her head and betrayed her secret, or had she committed some act of imprudence of which the report had come back to her husband? "Do sit down," said the painter, weakly. But his visitor, remaining sternly upright, shook his head and glanced at his wristwatch. "My moments," he said, are numbered. Literally. All I have time for is to implore you to look after my wife." He drew a handkerchief from his glossy cuff and rubbed his eyeglasses. "Your wife?" Campton echoed, dismayed. "My dear sir, haven't you guessed? It's George's wonderful example, his inspiration. I've been converted. We men of culture can't stand by while the ignorant and illiterate are left to die for us. We must leave that attitude to the barbarian. Our duty is to set an example. I'm off tonight for America, for Plattsburgh." "Oh," gasped Campton, wringing his hand. Boylston burst into the studio the next day. "What did I tell you, sir? George's influence, it wakes up everybody. But talk it! I'll be hanged if I should have thought it. And have you seen his wife? She's a war goddess. I went to the station with them. Their farewells were harrowing. At that minute, you know, I believe she'd forgotten that George ever existed." "Well, thank God for that," Campton cried. "Yes. Don't you feel how we're all being swept into it?" panted Boylston breathlessly. His face had caught the illumination. "Sealed, as George says. We're sealed to the job, every one of us. Even I feel that, sitting here at a stuffy desk." He flushed crimson, and his eyes filled. "We'll be in it, you know. America will, in a few weeks now, I believe. George was as sure of it as I am. And of course, if the war goes on, our army will have to take short-sighted officers, won't they, sir? As England and France did from the first. They'll need the men. They'll need us all, sir. They'll need you, my dear chap, and they'll have you to the full, whatever your job is." Campton smiled. And Boylston, choking back a sob, dashed off again. Yes, they were all being swept into it together, swept into the yawning whirlpool. Campton felt that as clearly as all these young men. He felt the triviality, the utter unimportance of all their personal and private concerns, compared with this great headlong outpouring of life on the altar of conviction. And he understood why, for youths like George and Boylston, nothing, however close and personal to them, would matter till the job was over. And not even for poor Talkett, he reflected whimsically. That afternoon, curiously appeased, he returned once more to his picture of his son. He had sketched the boy leaning out of the train window, smiling back, signaling, saying goodbye, while his destiny rushed him out into darkness as years ago the train used to rush him back to school. And while Campton worked, he caught the glow again. It rested on brow and eyes and spread in sure touches under his happy brush. One day, as the picture progressed, he wavered over the remembrance of some little detail of the face, and went in search of an old portfolio into which, from time to time, he had been in the habit of thrusting his unfinished studies of George. He plunged his hand into the heap, and Georges of all ages looked forth at him. Round baby Georges, freckled schoolboys, a thoughtful long-faced youth, the delicate George of St. Moritz. But none seemed quite to serve his purpose, and he rummaged on till he came to a page torn from an old sketchbook. It was the pencil study he had made of George as the lad lay asleep at the Creon the night before his mobilization. Campton threw the sketch down on the table, and as he sat staring at it, he relived every phase of the emotion out of which it had been born. How little he had known then, how little he had understood. He could bear to look at the drawing now, could bear even to rethink the shuddering thoughts with which he had once flung it away from him. Was it only because the atmosphere was filled with a growing sense of hope? Because, in spite of everything, the victory of Verdun was there to show the inexhaustible strength of France, because people were more and more sure that America was beginning to waken, or just because, after too long and fierce a strain, human nature always instinctively contrives to get its necessary whiff of moral oxygen? Or was it that George's influence had really penetrated him, and that this strange, renewed confidence in life and in ideals was his son's message of reassurance? Certainly the old George was there, close to him, that morning. And somewhere else, in scenes how different. He was sure that the actual George, at that very moment, was giving out force and youth and hope to those about him. I couldn't be doing this if I didn't understand, at last, Campton thought, as he turned back to the easel. The little pencil sketch had given him just the hint he needed, and he took up his palette with a happy sigh. A knock broke in on his rapt labor, and without turning, he called out, "Damn it, who are you? Can't you read the sign? Not in!" The door opened, and Mr. Brant entered. He appeared not to have heard the painter's challenge. His eyes, from the threshold, sprang straight to the portrait and remained vacantly fastened there. Campton, long afterward, remembered thinking, as he followed the glance, "He'll be trying to buy this one, too." Mr. Brant moistened his lips, and his gaze, detaching itself from George's face, moved back in the same vacant way to Campton's. The two men looked at each other, and Campton jumped to his feet. Not. Mr. Brant tried to speak, and the useless effort contracted his mouth in a pitiful grimace. "My son?" Campton shrieked, catching him by the arm. The little man dropped into a chair. Not dead. Hope was shaken out of him in jerks of anguish. The door burst open again, and Boylston dashed in beaming. He waved aloft a handful of morning papers. "America! You've seen! They've sacked Bernstorff. Broken off diplomatic—" His face turned white, and he stood staring incredulously from one of the two bowed men to the other. End of chapter 34. Recording by Riley McGuire. Chapter 35 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 35. Campton once more stood leaning in the window of a Paris hospital. Before him, but viewed at another angle, was spread that same great spectacle of the Place de la Concorde that he had looked down at from the Crillon on the eve of mobilization. Behind him, in a fresh white bed, George lay in the same attitude as when his father had stood in the door of his room and sketched him while he slept. All day there had run through Campton's mind the clairvoyant's promise to Julia: "Your son will come back soon and will never be sent to the front again." Ah, this time it was true. Never would he be sent to the front again. They had him fast now, had him safe. That was the one certainty. Fast how? Safe how? The answer to that had long hung in the balance. For 2 weeks or more after his return, the surgeons had hesitated. Then youth had seemed to conquer, and the parents had been told to hope that after a long period of immobility, George's shattered frame would slowly reknit and he would walk again, or at least hobble. A month had gone by since then, and Campton could at last trust himself to cast his mind back over the intervening days, so like in their anguish to those at Doullens, yet so different in all that material aid and organization could give. Evacuation from the base, now so systematically and promptly effected, had become a matter of course in all but the gravest cases, and even the delicate undertaking of deflecting George's course from the hospital near the front to which he had been destined and bringing him to Paris had been accomplished by a word in the right quarter from Mr. Brant. Campton, from the first, had been opposed to the attempt to bring George to Paris, partly, perhaps, because he felt that in the quiet provincial hospital near the front he would be able to have his son to himself. At any rate, the journey would have been shorter, though, as against that, Paris offered more possibilities of surgical aid. His opposition had been violent enough to check his growing friendliness with the Brants, and at the hours when they came to see George, Campton now most often contrived to be absent. Well, at any rate, George was alive. He was there under his father's eye. He was going to live. There seemed to be no doubt about it now. Campton could think it all over slowly and even calmly, marveling at the miracle and taking it in. So at least he had imagined till he first made the attempt. Then the old sense of unreality enveloped him again, and he struggled vainly to clutch at something tangible amid the swimming mists. George, George, George. He used to say the name over and over below his breath as he sat and watched at his son's bedside. But it sounded far off and hollow, like the voice of a ghost calling for another. Who was George? What did the name represent? The father left his post in the window and turned back to the bed, once more searching the boy's face for enlightenment. But George's eyes were closed. Sleep lay on him like an impenetrable veil. The sleep of ordinary men was not like that. The light of their daily habits continued to shine through the chinks of their closed faces. But with these others, these who had been down into the lower circles of the pit, it was different. Sleep instantly and completely sucked them back into the unknown. There were times when Campton, thus watching beside his son, used to say to himself, "If he were dead, he could not be farther from me." So deeply did George seem plunged into secret traffic with things unutterable. Now and then Campton, sitting beside him, seemed to see a little way into those darknesses, but after a moment he always shuddered back to daylight, benumbed, inadequate, weighed down with the weakness of the flesh and the incapacity to reach beyond his habitual limit of sensation. "No wonder they don't talk to us," he mused. By and by, perhaps, when George was well again, and the war over, the father might penetrate into his son's mind and find some new ground of communion with him. Now the thing was not to be conceived. He recalled again Adele Anthony's asking him, when he had come back from Doulin's, "What was the first thing you felt?" and his answering, "Nothing." Well, it was like that now. Every vibration had ceased in him. Between himself and George lay the unbridgeable abyss of his son's experiences. As he sat there, the door was softly opened a few inches, and Boylston's face showed through the crack. Light shot from it like the rays around a chalice. At a sign from him, Campton slipped out into the corridor, and Boylston silently pushed a newspaper into his grasp. He bent over it, trying with dazzled eyes to read sense into the staring headlines, but "America, America, America" was all that he could see. A nurse came gliding up on light feet. The tears were running down her face. "Yes, I know, I know, I know," she exulted. Up the tall stairs and through the ramifying of long white passages rose an unwanted rumor of sound, checked, subdued, invisibly rebuked, but ever again breaking out, like the noise of ripples on a windless beach. In every direction, nurses and orderlies were speeding from one room to another of the House of Pain with the message, "America has declared war on Germany." Campton and Boylston stole back into George's room. George lifted his eyelids and smiled at them, understanding before they spoke. "The 6th of April, remember the date," Boylston cried over him in a gleeful whisper. The wounded man, held fast in his splints, contrived to raise his head a little. His eyes laughed back into Boylston's. "You'll be in uniform within a week," he said, and Boylston crimsoned. Campton turned away again to the window. The day had come, and his son had lived to see it. So many of George's comrades had gone down to death without hope, and in a few months more George, leaning from that same window, or perhaps well enough to be watching the spectacle with his father from the terrace of the Tuileries, would look out on the first brown battalions marching across the Place de la Concorde, where father and son, in the early days of the war, had seen the young recruits of the Foreign Legion patrolling under improvised flags. At the thought, Campton felt a loosening of the tightness around his heart. Something which had been confused and uncertain in his relation to the whole long anguish was abruptly lifted, giving him the same sense of buoyancy that danced in Boylston's glance. At last, random atoms that they seemed all to have been shaken into their places, pressed into the huge mysterious design which was slowly curving a new firmament over a new earth. There was another knock, and a jubilant nurse appeared, hardly visible above a great bunch of lilacs, tied with a starred and striped ribbon. Campton, as he passed the flowers over to his son, noticed an envelope with Mrs. Talcott's perpendicular scrawl. George lay smiling, the lilacs close to his pillow, his free hand fingering the envelope, but he did not unseal the letter, and seemed to care less than ever to talk. After an interval, the door opened again, this time to show Mr. Brandt's guarded face. He drew back slightly at the sight of Campton, but Boylston, jumping up, passed close to the painter to breathe. "Today, sir, just today, you must." Campton went to the door and signed silently to Mr. Brandt to enter. Julia Brandt stood outside, flushed and tearful, carrying as many orchids as Mrs. Talcott had sent lilacs. Campton held out his hand, and with an embarrassed haste she stammered, "We couldn't wait." Behind her he saw Adele Anthony hurriedly coming up the stairs. For a few minutes they all stood or sat about George's bed, while their voices, beginning to speak low, rose uncontrollably, interrupting one another with tears and laughter. Mr. Brandt and Boylston were both brimming with news, and George, though he listened more than he spoke, now and then put a brief question which loosened fresh floods. Suddenly Campton noticed that the young man's face, which had been too flushed, grew pale, but he continued to smile and his eyes to move responsively from one illuminated face to the other. Campton, seeing that the others meant to linger, presently rose and slipping out quietly walked across the Rue de Rivoli to the deserted terrace of the Tuileries. There he sat for a long time, looking out on the vast, glittering spaces of the Place de la Concorde, and calling up, with his painter's faculty of vivid and precise visualization, a future vision of interminable lines of brown battalions marching past. When he returned to the hospital after dinner, the night nurse met him. She was not quite as well satisfied with her patient that evening. Hadn't he perhaps had too many visitors? Yes, of course. She knew it had been a great day, a day of international rejoicing, above all a blessed day for France. But the doctors, from the beginning, must have warned Mr. Campton that his son ought to be kept quiet, very quiet. The last operation had been a great strain on his heart. Yes, certainly, Mr. Campton might go in. The patient had asked for him. Oh, there was no danger, no need for anxiety. Only he must not stay too long. His son must try to sleep. Campton nodded and stole in. George lay motionless in the shaded lamplight. His eyes were open, but they seemed to reflect his father's presence without any change of expression, like mirrors rather than like eyes. The room was doubly silent after the joyful hubbub of the afternoon. The nurse had put the orchids and lilacs where George's eyes could rest on them. But was it on the flowers that his gaze so tranquilly dwelt? Or did he see in their place the faces of their senders? Or was he again in that far country where no other eyes could follow him? Campton took his usual seat by the bed. Father and son looked at each other, and the old George glanced out for half a second between the wounded man's lids. "There was too much talking today," Campton grumbled. "Was there? I didn't notice." His son smiled. No, he hadn't noticed. He didn't notice anything. He was a million miles away again, whirling into his place in the awful pattern of that new firmament. "Tired, old man?" Campton asked under his breath. "No, just glad," said George contentedly. His father laid a hand on his and sat silently beside him while the spring night blew in upon them through the open window. The quiet streets grew quieter. The hush in their hearts seemed gradually to steal over the extinguished city. Campton kept saying to himself, "I must be off," and still not moving. The nurse was sure to come back presently. Why should he not wait till she dismissed him? After a while, seeing that George's eyes had closed, Campton rose and crept across the room to darken the lamp with a newspaper. His movement must have roused his son, for he heard a slight struggle behind him and the low cry, "Father!" Campton turned and reached the bed in a stride. George, ashy white, had managed to lift himself a little on his free elbow. "Anything wrong?" the father cried. "No, everything all right," George said. He dropped back, his lids closing again, and a single twitch ran through the hand that Campton had seized. After that, he lay stiller than ever. End of chapter 35. Recording by Riley McGuire. Chapter 36 of A Son at the Front. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Riley McGuire. A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton. Chapter 36. George's prediction had come true. At his funeral, 3 days afterward, Boylston, a new-fledged member of the American military mission, was already in uniform. But through what perversity of attention did the fact strike Campton as he stood, a blank, unfeeling automaton, in the front pew behind that coffin draped with flags and flanked with candle glitter? Why did one thing rather than another reach to his deadened brain, and mostly the trivial things, such as Boylston's being already in uniform, and poor Julia's nose, under the harsh crape, looking so blue-red without its powder, and the chaplain's asking, "O grave, where is thy victory?" in the querulous tone of a schoolmaster reproaching a pupil who mislaid things. It was always so with Campton. When sorrow fell, it left him insensible and dumb. Not till long afterward did he begin to feel its birth pangs. They first came to him, those pangs, on a morning of the following July, as he sat once more on the terrace of the Tuileries. Most of his time, during the months since George's death, had been spent in endless, aimless wanderings up and down the streets of Paris, and that day, descending early from Montmartre, he had noticed in his listless way that all the buildings on his way were fluttering with American flags. The fact left him indifferent. Paris was always decorating nowadays for one ally or another. Then he remembered that it must be the 4th of July, but the idea of the 4th of July came to him through the same haze of indifference as a mere far-off childish memory of surreptitious explosions and burnt fingers. He strolled on toward the Tuileries, where he had got into the way of sitting for hours at a time, looking across the square at what had once been George's window. He was surprised to find the Rue de Rivoli packed with people, but his only thought was the instinctive one of turning away to avoid them, and he began to retrace his steps in the direction of the Louvre. Then at a corner he paused again and looked back at the Place de la Concorde. It was not curiosity that drew him, heaven knew. He would never again be curious about anything. But he suddenly remembered the day 3 months earlier when, leaning from George's window in the hospital, he said to himself, "By the time our first regiments arrive, he'll be up and looking at them from here, or sitting with me over there on the terrace." And that decided him to turn back. It was as if he had felt the pressure of George's hand on his arm. Though it was still so early, he had some difficulty in pushing his way through the throng. No seats were left on the terrace, but he managed to squeeze into a corner near one of the great vases of the balustrade, and leaning there, with the happy hubbub about him, he watched and waited. Such a summer morning it was, and such a strange, grave beauty had fallen on the place. He seemed to understand, for the first time, he who had served beauty all his days, how profoundly, at certain hours, it may become the symbol of things hoped for and things died for. All those stately spaces and raying distances, witnesses of so many memorable scenes, might have been called together just as the setting for this one event, the sight of a few brown battalions passing over them like a feeble trail of insects. Campton, with a vague awakening of interest, glanced about him, studying the faces of the crowd. Old and young, infirm and healthy, civilians and soldiers. Ah, the soldiers! All were exultant, confident, alive. Alive! The word meant something new to him now, something so strange and unnatural that his mind still hung and brooded over it. For now that George was dead, by what mere blind propulsion did all these thousands of human beings keep on mechanically living? He became aware that a boy, leaning over intervening shoulders, was trying to push a folded paper into his hand. On it was penciled, in Mr. Brandt's writing, "There will be a long time to wait. Will you take the seat I have kept next to mine?" Campton glanced down the terrace, saw where the little man sat at its farther end, and shook his head. Then some contradictory impulse made him decide to get up, laboriously work his halting frame through the crowd, and insert himself into the place next to Mr. Brandt. The two men nodded without shaking hands. After that they sat silent, their eyes on the empty square. Campton noticed that Mr. Brandt wore his usual grey clothes, but with a mourning band on the left sleeve. The sight of that little band irritated Campton. There was, as Mr. Brandt had predicted, a long interval of waiting, but at length a murmur of jubilation rose far off, and gathering depth and volume came bellowing and spraying up to where they sat. The square, the Champs-Élysées, and all the leafy distances were flooded with it. It was as though the voice of Paris had sprung up in fountains out of her stones. Then a military march broke shrilly on the tumult, and there they came at last in a scant swaying line, so few, so new, so raw, so little in comparison with the immense assemblages familiar to the place, so much in meaning and in promise. How badly they march! There hasn't even been time to drill them properly, Campton thought, and at the thought he felt a choking in his throat, and his sorrow burst up in him in healing springs. It was after that day that he first went back to his work. He had not touched paint or pencil since George's death. Now he felt the inspiration and the power returning, and he began to spend his days among the young American officers and soldiers, studying them, talking to them, going about with them, and then hurrying home to jot down his impressions. He had not, as yet, looked at his last study of George, or opened the portfolio with the old sketches. If anyone had asked him, he would probably have said that they no longer interested him. His whole creative faculty was curiously, mysteriously engrossed in the recording of the young faces for whose coming George had yearned. "It's their marching so badly. It's their not even having had time to be drilled," he said to Boylston, half shamefacedly, as they sat together one August evening in the studio window. Campton seldom saw Boylston nowadays. All the young man's time was taken up by his job with the understaffed and inexperienced military mission. But fagged as he was by continual overwork and heavy responsibilities, his blinking eyes had at last lost their unsatisfied look, and his whole busy person radiated hope and encouragement. On the day in question he had turned up unexpectedly, inviting himself to dine with Campton and smoke a cigar afterward in the quiet window overhanging Paris. Campton was glad to have him there. No one could tell him more than Boylston about the American soldiers, their numbers, the accommodations prepared for their reception, their first contact with the other belligerents, and their own view of the business they were about. And the two chatted quietly in the twilight till the young man, rising, said it was time to be off. "Back to your shop?" "Rather. There's a night's work ahead. But I'm as good as new after our talk." Campton looked at him wistfully. "You know I'd like to paint you some day." "Oh," cried Boylston, suffused with blushes, and added with a laugh, "It's my uniform, not me." "Well, your uniform is you. It's all of you young men." Boylston stood in the window, twisting his cap about undecidedly. "Look here, sir, now that you've got back to work again—" "Well?" Campton interrupted suspiciously. The young man cleared his throat and spoke with a rush. "His mother wants most awfully that something should be decided about the monument." "Monument? What monument? I don't want my son to have a monument," Campton exploded. But Boylston stuck to his point. "It'll break her heart if something isn't put on the grave before long. It's 5 months now, and they fully recognize your right to decide—" "Damn what they recognize! It was they who brought him to Paris. They made him travel when he wasn't fit. They killed him." "Well, supposing they did, judge how much more they must be suffering." "Let him suffer. He's my son. My son. He isn't Brant's." "Miss Anthony thinks—" "And he's not hers either, that I know of." Boylston seemed to hesitate. "Well, that's just it, isn't it, sir? You've had him. You have him still. Nobody can touch that fact, or take it from you. Every hour of his life was yours. But they've never had anything, those two others, Mr. Brant and Miss Anthony. Nothing but a reflected light. And so every outward sign means more to them. I'm putting it badly, I know." Campton held out his hand. "You don't mean to, I suppose. But better not put it at all. Good night," he said. And on the threshold he called out sardonically, "And who's going to pay for a monument, I'd like to know?" A monument! They wanted a monument. Wanted him to decide about it, plan it, perhaps design it. Good Lord, he didn't know. No doubt it all seemed simple enough to them. Anything did that money could buy. When he couldn't yet bear to turn that last canvas out from the wall, or look into the old portfolio even. Suffering, suffering! What did they, any of them, know about suffering? Going over old photographs, comparing studies, recalling scenes and sayings, discussing with some sculptor or other the shape of George's eyelids, the spring of his chest muscles, the way his hair grew and his hands moved. Why, it was like digging him up again out of that peaceful corner of the Neuilly cemetery where at last he was resting, like dragging him back to the fret and the fever and the senseless roar of the guns that still went on. And then, as he'd said to Boylston, who was to pay for their monument? Even if the making of it had struck him as a way of getting nearer to his boy, instead of building up a marble wall between them, even if the idea had appealed to him, he hadn't a penny to spare for such an undertaking. In the first place, he never intended to paint again for money. Never intended to do anything but these gaunt and serious or round and babyish young American faces above their stiff military collars, and when their portraits were finished to put them away, locked up for his own pleasure. And what he had earned in the last years was to be partly for these young men, for their reading rooms, clubs, recreation centers, whatever was likely to give them temporary rest and solace in the grim months to come, and partly for such of the protégés of the Friends of French Art as had been deprived of aid under the new management. Tales of private jealousy and petty retaliation came to Campton daily, now that Madame Beausite administered the funds. Adele Anthony and Mademoiselle d'Avril, bursting with the wrongs of their pensioners, were always appealing to him for help. And then, hidden behind these more or less valid reasons, the old instinctive dread of spending had reasserted itself. He couldn't tell how or why, unless through some dim opposition to the Brants' perpetual outpouring, their hospitals, their motors, their bribes, their orchids, and now their monument. Their monument. He sought refuge from it all with his soldiers, haunting for hours every day one of the newly opened soldiers' and sailors' clubs. Adele Anthony had already found a job there and was making a success of it. She looked 20 years older since George was gone, but she stuck to her work with the same humorous pertinacity, and with her mingled heartiness and ceremony, her funny resuscitation of obsolete American slang, and her ability to answer all their most disconcerting questions about Paris and France, Montmartre included, she easily eclipsed the ministering angels who twanged the hometown chord and called them boys. The young men appeared to return Campton's liking. It was as if they had guessed that he needed them and wanted to offer him their shy help. He was conscious of something rather protecting in their attitude, of his being to them a vague, unidentified figure, merely the old gentleman who was friendly to them. But he didn't mind. It was enough to sit and listen to their talk, to try and clear up a few of the countless puzzles which confronted them, to render them such fatherly services as he could, and in the interval to jot down notes of their faces, their inexhaustibly inspiring faces. Sometimes to talk with them was like being on the floor in George's nursery, among the blocks and the tin soldiers, sometimes like walking with young archangels in a cool empty heaven. But wherever he was, he always had the sense of being among his own, the sense he had never had since George's death. To think of them all as George's brothers, to study out the secret likeness to him in their young, dedicated faces, that was now his one passion, his sustaining task. It was at such times that his son came back and sat among them. Gradually, as the weeks passed, the first of his new friends, officers and soldiers, were dispersed throughout the training camps, and new faces succeeded to those he had tried to fix on his canvas. An endless line of Benny Upshers, baby Georges, schoolboy Boylstons they seemed to be. Campton saw each one go with a fresh pang, knowing that every move brought them so much nearer to the front, that ever-ravening and inexorable front. They were always happy to be gone, and that only increased his pain. Now and then he attached himself more particularly to one of the young men, because of some look of the eyes or some turn of the mind, like George's. And then the parting became anguish. One day a second lieutenant came to the studio to take leave. He had been an early recruit of Plattsburgh, and his military training was so far advanced that he counted on being among the first officers sent to the fighting line. He was a fresh-colored lad with fair hair that stood up in a defiant crest. "There are so few of us, and there's so little time to lose, they can't afford to be too particular," he laughed. It was just the sort of thing that George would have said, and the laugh was like an echo of George's. At the sound, Campton suddenly burst into tears, and was aware of his visitors looking at him with eyes of dismay and compassion. "Oh, don't, sir, don't," the young man pleaded, wringing the painter's hand and making what decent haste he could to get out of the studio. Campton, left alone, turned once more to his easel. He sat down before a canvas on which he had blocked out a group of soldiers playing cards at their club, but after a stroke or two he threw aside his brush and remained with his head bowed on his hands, a lonely, tired old man. He had kept a cheerful front at his son's going, and now he could not say good-bye to one of these young fellows without crying. Well, it was because he had no one left of his own, he supposed. Loneliness like his took all a man's strength from him. The bell rang, but he did not move. It rang again, then the door was pushed timidly open, and Mrs. Talkett came in. He had not seen her since the day of George's funeral, when he had fancied he detected her in a shrunken black-veiled figure hurrying past in the meaningless line of mourners. In her usual abrupt fashion she began, without a greeting, "I've come to say goodbye. I'm going to America." He looked at her remotely, hardly hearing what she said. "To America?" "Yes, to join my husband." He continued to consider her in silence, and she frowned in her perplexed and fretful way. "He's at Plattsburgh, you know." Her eyes wandered unseeingly about the studio. "There's nothing else to do, is there, now? Here, or anywhere?" "So I sail tomorrow. I mean to take a house somewhere near him. He's not well, and he writes that he misses me. The life in camp is so unsuited to him." Campton still listened absently. "Oh, you're right to go," he agreed at length, supposing it was what she expected of him. "Am I?" She half smiled. "What's right and what's wrong? I don't know any longer. I'm only trying to do what I suppose George would have wanted." She stood uncertainly in front of Campton. "All I do know," she cried, with a sharp break in her voice, "is that I've never in my life been happy enough to be so unhappy." And she threw herself down on the divan in a storm of desolate sobbing. After he had comforted her as best he could, and she had gone away, Campton continued to wander up and down the studio forlornly. That cry of hers kept on echoing in his ears. "I've never in my life been happy enough to be so unhappy." It associated itself suddenly with the phrase of Boylston's that he had brushed away unheeding. "You've had your son. You have him still. But those others have never had anything." Yes, Campton saw now that it was true of poor Madge Talkett, as it was of Adele Anthony and Mr. Brant, and even in a measure of Julia. They had never, no, not even George's mother, had anything, in the close, inextricable sense in which Campton had had his son. And it was only now, in his own hour of destitution, that he understood how much greater the depth of their poverty had been. He recalled the frightened, embarrassed look of the young lieutenant whom he had discountenanced by his tears, and he said to himself, "The only thing that helps is to be able to do things for people. I suppose that's why Brant's always trying." Julia, too. It was strange that his thoughts should turn to her with such peculiar pity. It was not because the boy had been born of her body. Campton did not see her now, as he had once had in a brief moment of compassion, as the young mother bending illumined above her baby. He saw her as an old, empty-hearted woman, and asked himself how such an unmanageable monster as grief was to fill the room up of her absent son. What did such people as Julia do with grief, he wondered? How did they make room for it in their lives, get up and lie down every day with its taste on their lips? Its elemental quality, that awful sense it communicated of a whirling earth, a crumbling time, and all the cold, stellar spaces yawning to receive us, these feelings which he was beginning to discern and to come to terms with in his own way, and with the sense that it would have been George's way too, these feelings could never give their stern appeasement to Julia. Her religion? Yes, such as it was, no doubt it would help. Talking with the rector would help, giving more time to her church charities, her wounded soldiers, imagining that she was paying some kind of tax on her affliction. But the vacant evenings at home, face to face with Brant. Campton had long since seen that the one thing which had held the two together was their shared love of George, and if Julia discovered, as she could hardly fail to do, how much more deeply Brant had loved her son than she had, and how much more inconsolably he mourned him, that would only increase her sense of isolation. And so, in sheer self-defense, she would gradually, stealthily, fill up the void with the old occupations, with bridge and visits and secret consultations at the dressmaker's about the width of crape on her dresses. And all the while the object of life would be gone for her. Yes, He pitied Julia most of all. But Mr. Brant too, perhaps in a different way, it was he who suffered most. For the stellar spaces were not exactly Mr. Brant's native climate, and yet voices would call to him from them, and he would not know. There were moments when Campton looked about him with astonishment at the richness of his own denuded life, when George was in the sunset, in the voices of young people, or in any trivial joke that father and son would have shared, and other moments when he was nowhere, utterly lost, extinct and irrecoverable, and others again when the one thing which could have vitalized the dead business of living would have been to see him shove open the studio door, stalk in, pour out some coffee for himself in his father's cup, and diffuse through the air the warm sense of his bodily presence, the fresh smell of his clothes and his flesh and his hair. But through all these moods Campton began to see there ran the life-giving power of a reality embraced and accepted. George had been. George was. As long as his father's consciousness lasted, George would be as much a part of it as the closest, most actual of his immediate sensations. He had missed nothing of George, and here was his harvest, his golden harvest. Such states of mind were not constant with Campton, but more and more often, when they came, they swept him on eagle wings over the next desert to the next oasis, and so, gradually, the meaningless days became linked to each other in some kind of intelligible sequence. Boylston, after the talk which had so agitated Campton, did not turn up again at the studio for some time, but when he next appeared the painter, hardly pausing to greet him, began at once as if they had just parted. "That monument you spoke about the other day, you know." Boylston glanced at him in surprise. "If they want me to do it, I'll do it," Campton went on, jerking the words out abruptly and walking away toward the window. He had not known, till he began, that he had meant to utter them, or how difficult they would be to say, and he stood there a moment, struggling with the unreasoning, rebellious irritability which so often lay in wait for his better impulses. At length he turned back, his hands in his pockets, clinking his change, as he had done the first time that Boylston had come to him for help. "But as I planned the thing," he began again, in a queer, growling tone, "it's going to cost a lot. Everything of the sort does nowadays, especially in marble. It's hard enough to get anyone to do that kind of work at all, and prices have about tripled, you know." Boylston's eyes filled, and he nodded, still without speaking. "That's just what Brant'll like, though, isn't it?" Campton said, with an irrepressible sneer in his voice. He saw Boylston redden and look away, and he too flushed to the forehead and broke off, ashamed. Suddenly he had the vision of Mr. Brant effacing himself at the foot of the hospital stairs when they had arrived at Doulin's, Mr. Brant drawing forth the copy of the orderly's letter in the dark fog-swept cloister, Mr. Brant always yielding, always holding back, yet always remembering to do or to say the one thing the father's lacerated soul could bear. "And he's had nothing, nothing, nothing," Campton thought. He turned again to Boylston, his face still flushed, his lips twitching. Tell Brant, that I'll design the thing. I'll design it, and he shall pay for it. He'll want to. I understand that. Only, for God's sake, don't let him come here and thank me, at least not for a long time." Boylston again nodded silently and turned to go. After he had gone, the painter moved back to his long table. He had always had a fancy for modeling, had always had lumps of clay lying about within reach. He pulled out all the sketches of his son from the old portfolio, spread them before him on the table, and began. Paris, 1918. Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, 1922. The end. End of chapter 36. Recording by Riley McGuire. End of A Son at the Front by Edith Wharton.